Alexander Sterling couldn't believe his ears as his trusted branch manager coached employees on how to exploit senior citizens' confusion about digital banking. The billionaire founder of Sterling Financial had built his empire on the promise of ethical banking, but what he discovered in the next 3 weeks would shake the entire financial industry to its core. Alexander Sterling gazed out the window of his penthouse office on the 60th floor of Sterling Tower, the golden letters of his family's banking empire gleaming in the setting sun across Manhattan's skyline. The email on his screen seemed to mock everything he'd built over the last 20 years. Mr. Sterling, your banks aren't serving communities anymore. They're preying on them. The elderly, immigrants, working families, they're all targets now, but you'll never see it from your tower. Your managers know exactly when corporate auditors are coming. They know how to hide the truth. Want proof? Visit Sterling Community Bank, branch number 247, Queens. Watch how they treat Mrs. Rodriguez when she comes in for her Social Security check. But don't take my word for it. See for yourself. He'd received dozens of anonymous complaints before, but something about this one felt different. The specificity, the challenge, the raw emotion behind the words. His finger hovered over the delete button, the usual response to anonymous tips. But he couldn't shake the urgency in the message. Sterling Financial had grown from a single neighborhood bank in Brooklyn to over 500 branches across the East Coast. Alexander had built it on his father's principles. Banking should serve the community, not exploit it. A bank's true wealth is measured by the lives it improves, not the profits it makes, his father used to say. Now, at 45, Alexander wondered if he'd lost touch with those values. The quarterly reports showed record profits. Customer satisfaction surveys were stellar. His board of directors had just voted him Banking CEO of the Year. Yet the anonymous emails kept coming, each one more detailed than the last, all pointing to a disturbing pattern at various branches. His chief of corporate security, Victoria Hayes, had suggested sending in the usual audit teams. "We'll do a thorough investigation, Mr. Sterling," she assured him, sliding another glowing compliance report across his desk. "Our procedures are foolproof." But Alexander remembered something his father had told him during the 2008 financial crisis. The moment you think your systems are foolproof is the moment you've been fooled completely. Standing before his bathroom mirror the next morning, Alexander studied his reflection. His designer suits, perfectly trimmed salt and pepper hair, and confident bearing had graced the covers of financial magazines. The man staring back at him now was someone else entirely. Generous application of temporary hair dye had turned his distinguished grey a muddy brown. Contact lenses changed his striking blue eyes to a warm brown. A week of deliberately neglected shaving had left him with an unkempt beard that added years to his appearance. Gone was the bespoke Italian suit, replaced by off-the-rack khakis and a slightly wrinkled dress shirt from Target. The Patek Philippe watch passed down from his father was locked away, a $30 Timex taking its place. He'd even practiced changing, his posture replacing his usual straight-backed confidence with a slight stoop, the bearing of someone who'd seen too many rejections. "Who are you trying to fool?" he muttered, adjusting the unfamiliar wire-rimmed glasses. The answer wasn't just his employees. It was himself. He'd spent years believing his father's bank was still intact beneath the corporate expansion. Now it was time to discover the truth. The story he'd crafted was simple enough. Michael Crawford, a former middle manager at a regional bank in Ohio, laid off during a merger, desperately seeking a fresh start. His resume showed a solid but unremarkable career, the kind that would qualify him for a personal banker position without raising any red flags. Sterling Financial's HR department, unaware of their CEO's involvement, had processed his application just like any other. The drive to Queens that morning felt surreal. Instead of his usual chauffeur-driven Tesla, Alexander navigated through morning traffic in a used Honda Civic, its faded blue paint and slight rust spots ensuring it would blend perfectly in the bank's employee parking lot. Branch 247 looked different from this angle. He'd visited before, of course, for the grand opening 5 years ago, smiling for photos and giving speeches about community investment. But he'd always entered through the front, greeted by polished smiles and practiced enthusiasm. Now walking around to the employee entrance in the back, he saw the worn paint, the overflowing dumpster, the cigarette butts scattered near the staff door. Small details that would never make it into corporate reports, but spoke volumes about the daily reality of his bank. Crawford, Michael Crawford. A sharp voice cut through his observations. A woman in her 50s, wearing a badge that identified her as Helen Martinez, branch operations manager, stood in the doorway. Her smile was professional, but her eyes were calculating, assessing him like a risk factor on a loan application. "You're late. Orientation started 5 minutes ago. Richard hates tardiness. Not a good first impression for our new personal banker." She gestured him inside, her heels clicking rapidly on the linoleum floor. "Though looking at your resume, you should be grateful to be here at all. Regional banks aren't exactly known for their rigorous standards." Alexander felt his face flush at the casual condescension, an unfamiliar sensation for someone used to commanding boardrooms. As he followed Helen through the back offices, he noticed things his corporate auditors had apparently missed. The dated computers running ancient versions of their banking software. The security camera that hung loosely from its mount, its lens pointed uselessly at the ceiling. The fire exit partially blocked by boxes of marketing materials. "Welcome to Sterling Financial." Richard Barnes, the branch manager, addressed the small group of new hires in the cramped training room. His smile reminded Alexander of a shark. "Let's be clear about one thing. We're not here to make friends with customers. We're here to meet targets. Every interaction is an opportunity to sell. Every customer has untapped potential for fees and services. Your job is to find those opportunities and exploit them. If you can't handle that, Friendly Federal down the street is always hiring." Alexander felt his chest tighten. This wasn't banking. This was predatory sales disguised as service. As Richard continued his orientation, describing various strategies for pushing unnecessary products on customers, Alexander realized the anonymous email had only hinted at the truth. He'd walked in expecting to find isolated problems. Instead, he was discovering that the very soul of his father's bank might be corrupted. His phone vibrated silently in his pocket, another anonymous email. "Now you see, Mr. Sterling, but this is just the surface. Watch carefully tomorrow when Mrs. Rodriguez comes in. Some truths are harder to face than others." Alexander slipped the phone back into his pocket, his mind racing. Day one had barely started, and already he knew his bank had lost its way. The question was, how deep did the corruption go, and what would it cost him to make things right? The morning sun hadn't yet touched the bank's windows when Alexander arrived for his second day. He'd spent a sleepless night reviewing branch reports on his laptop, searching for patterns he might have missed from his executive perch. The numbers were impeccable. Too impeccable, he now realized. "Crawford," Richard's voice cut through his thoughts. "Take the first window today. Mrs. Rodriguez comes in every Thursday morning to cash her Social Security check. Perfect opportunity to show us your skills." The branch manager's smile didn't reach his eyes. Alexander's window had barely opened when he saw her. An elderly woman carefully making her way through the front door, her weathered hands clutching a worn leather purse. Maria Rodriguez, according to her account profile, had been with Sterling Financial for over 30 years. She'd opened her account when Alexander's father still greeted customers by name. "Buenos dias." She smiled warmly, sliding her social security check across the counter. Before Alexander could respond, Helen materialized. Beside him, Mrs. Rodriguez, we were just discussing your account. Have you considered our new digital elite package? It's perfect for managing your retirement funds. Alexander watched in growing horror as Helen launched into a practiced pitch. The elite package carried hefty monthly fees and was designed for high-net-worth clients managing multiple investment accounts, completely inappropriate for someone living on Social Security. I don't understand all this computer stuff, Mrs. Rodriguez replied hesitantly. I just need to cash my check. That's exactly why you need this service, Helen pressed. We'll handle everything for you. Just sign here and we'll set it all up. The first month's fees are waived. Alexander noticed Mrs. Rodriguez's hands trembling as Helen pushed the paperwork forward. He opened his mouth to intervene, but Richard's presence behind him was a silent warning. I should maybe talk to my son first, Mrs. Rodriguez began. This special offer ends today, Helen interjected smoothly. Your son would want you to have the best protection for your money, wouldn't he? As Mrs. Rodriguez reluctantly reached for the pen, Alexander saw his father's face in his mind. Banker's first duty is to protect, not profit, he used to say. The words struck him like a physical blow. Mrs. Rodriguez, Alexander heard himself say, perhaps we should review your current accounts first. These fees might impact your monthly budget significantly. Helen's sharp intake of breath beside him was audible. Crawford, my office, now. Richard's voice could have frozen water. The branch manager's office felt smaller than Alexander remembered from his executive tours. Richard closed the door with exaggerated care. Let me explain something, Crawford. Every customer who walks through that door is a target. Every interaction is a sales opportunity. Mrs. Rodriguez has been refusing our premium services for months. She's exactly the type we need to guide firmly toward better options. She can't afford those fees, Alexander protested. The fees aren't the point, Richard snapped. Once they're enrolled, most seniors never figure out how to cancel. They trust the bank. Besides, corporate loves these numbers. Do you know how many commendations I've received for our senior financial services program? Alexander felt bile rise in his throat. He'd signed those commendations himself, praising Richard's team for their exceptional community outreach. That evening, after his shift, Alexander lingered in the parking lot watching. One by one, employees hurried to their cars, but Richard and Helen remained inside. Through the office window, he could see them huddled over documents, speaking animatedly. His phone buzzed. Another anonymous message. Check the secure document destruction bin. They missed something this morning. And tomorrow, pay attention to the investment seminars in the conference room. Not all victims are as obvious as Mrs. Rodriguez. The bank's back door was still unlocked. In the darkened building, Alexander found the document bin, required by corporate policy to be emptied and shredded daily. Inside, beneath crumpled papers, he found torn fragments of what looked like investment certificates. As he pieced them together, his hands began to shake. The certificates were genuine, sterling financial documents, but the routing numbers were wrong. The investment accounts they referenced didn't exist in the bank's official system. Someone was running a shadow operation inside his bank, and vulnerable customers like Mrs. Rodriguez were only the beginning. His phone lit up again. Now you see the tip of the iceberg. But ask yourself, how many other branches have a Richard? How many Helens are out there helping seniors with their finances? Your father built a bank of trust. They've turned it into a factory of fraud. Alexander stared at the message, the pieces starting to click together. The impeccable branch reports, the stellar customer acquisition numbers, the unusually high percentage of senior clients enrolled in premium services. Everything looked perfect on paper because the paper itself was a lie. As he drove home in his borrowed Honda, past the lit windows of other Sterling branches dotting the city, a chilling question formed. Was branch the 247 an anomaly, or had he discovered the new normal of his father's bank? Investment opportunity of a lifetime, proclaimed the glossy brochures stacked neatly on Alexander's desk. The conference room was being prepared for another elite investment seminar, the third one this week. He watched as bank employees transformed the space, setting out elegant refreshments and hanging professionally designed banners promoting Sterling Financial's exclusive investment packages. "Crawford, make yourself useful," Helen commanded, thrusting a stack of folders into his hands. "These need to be distributed to our guests. Remember, we're looking for signatures today, not questions." She lowered her voice. "And if anyone asks about guaranteed returns, you know the script." The guests began arriving at 6 p.m., mostly retirees and immigrants, many clutching their existing bank statements and looking both hopeful and nervous. Alexander's heart sank as he recognized Mrs. Rodriguez among them, accompanied by an elderly man he assumed was her husband. Richard took the podium, his shark-like smile now turned up to full wattage. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. You're here because you're special customers. Customers we believe are ready for exceptional opportunities." As the presentation unfolded, Alexander felt physically ill. The investment packages being promoted were a masterwork of financial deception, complex fee structures hidden in microscopic print, withdrawal penalties that practically guaranteed trapped funds, interest rates that seemed remarkable until you decoded the Byzantine calculation methods. "Mr. Crawford, could you assist Mr. Chen?" Helen gestured toward an elderly Asian man who was squinting at the paperwork. Alexander approached, noticing the man's weathered hands, a lifetime of hard work evident in every callus. "My English, not so good," Mr. Chen apologized. "This paper say guaranteed 8%? Alexander glanced at the document. The 8% was prominently displayed, but the footnotes revealed the truth. It was a teaser rate that would plummet after 3 months, locked in by penalties too expensive for most clients to escape. "Sir, I should explain," Alexander began, but Richard smoothly interjected. "Mr. Chen, I see you're interested in our premier package. Excellent choice. Let me help you with that signature." Later that evening, after the seminar concluded, Alexander lingered behind, supposedly to help clean up. Instead, he slipped into Richard's office, his heart pounding. The branch manager had left his computer logged in, a violation of bank security protocols that would prove fortunate. What he found made his blood run cold. Spreadsheets tracking conversion rates of elderly and immigrant customers, reports highlighting the most vulnerable clients for targeted investment opportunities. But it was an email thread that truly shook him. From Victoria Hayes, Corporate Security, to Richard Barnes. Subject, Q3 Performance Review. Excellent work on the Senior Outreach Program. Board is thrilled with the numbers. Keep the investment seminars going. They're perfect for staying under regulatory radar. Remember to code any complaints as customer confusion rather than investment disputes. Attached, updated scripts for dealing with family members who ask questions. Victoria Hayes, his own head of corporate security, was not just aware of the fraud, but actively facilitating it. The corruption went straight to the top. A noise from the hallway sent Alexander diving behind a filing cabinet. Through the glass partition, he watched as Richard returned with Helen, both looking pleased. "Another successful seminar," Helen was saying. "Though that new guy, Crawford, he seems too interested in the fine print." "Keep him busy with basic accounts," Richard replied. "Can't risk having someone soft-hearted interfering with next week's big push." "Speaking of which," Helen lowered her voice, "is everything set for Operation Golden Years?" Alexander strained to hear Richard's response. "All arranged. We're rolling it out across 10 branches next month. Hayes says if it works here, they want to take it national. Imagine the bonuses." Their voices faded as they moved away. Alexander waited until the lights dimmed before emerging. His hands trembled as he photographed key documents with his phone. Operation Golden Years. It sounded innocuous enough, but combined with what he'd witnessed tonight, a new message lit up his phone. "Now you know. But tomorrow's meeting with the special investment team will show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Be careful. Some people are starting to ask questions about the curious new employee who takes such detailed notes." Alexander stared at his reflection in the darkened office window. His disguise felt increasingly flimsy against the magnitude of what he was uncovering. This wasn't just about predatory fees or misleading investment pitches anymore. His bank had become a sophisticated machine for exploiting the vulnerable, with tentacles reaching into the highest levels of corporate leadership. As he finally left the branch, he noticed Mr. Chen's forgotten reading glasses on a conference room table. Such a small thing, but it struck him hard. Behind every spreadsheet, every conversion rate, every fraudulent investment package was a real person whose trust was being brutally betrayed. Tomorrow's meeting with the special investment team loomed ahead. Alexander had a sickening feeling he was about to discover exactly what Operation Golden Years meant and why it needed corporate securities' direct involvement to stay under the regulatory radar. The special investment team meeting was held in the branch's basement, a windowless space officially designated for archive storage. Alexander descended the stairs, his borrowed shoes echoing against concrete steps. The familiar bank logos and motivational posters of the main floor were absent here. This space felt different, clinical, secretive. "ID badge," demanded a security guard Alexander had never seen before. The man's stern expression softened when Richard appeared behind them. "He's with me. Crawford's proven himself useful with our more hesitant clients." The basement had been transformed. Rows of computers lined the walls, staffed by people who definitely weren't regular bank employees. Their intense focus reminded Alexander of trading floors he'd visited, but something felt off. Multiple screens displayed what looked like customer account information, but the interfaces weren't Sterling Financial's standard systems. "Welcome to the engine room," a cultured voice announced. Xavier Thompson, Regional Director of Investment Services, stood by a central workstation. Alexander recognized him from quarterly board meetings, though they'd never spoken directly. "Richard tells me you have a talent for working with our elderly clients." "I try to understand their needs," Alexander replied carefully. "Admirable." Xavier smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Understanding is exactly what we do here. Let me show you how we're revolutionizing retirement banking." Over the next hour, Alexander witnessed a sophistication of fraud that took his breath away. The basement operation wasn't just about pushing predatory investments. It was a full-scale financial infiltration system. "Every senior client who attends our seminars gets flagged in the database," Xavier explained, pulling up detailed profiles. "We track their accounts, their family connections, their medical history, anything that helps us identify optimal targets." "Optimal targets?" Alexander asked, fighting to keep his voice neutral. "People with significant equity in their homes, recent widows, early-stage dementia patients who still have legal control of their assets." Xavier's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing weather patterns. "Once identified, we escalate them to Phase 2. Phase 2, it turned out, was where Operation Golden Years revealed its true nature. The investment seminars were just the beginning. Once elderly clients signed up for the premium services, their accounts were quietly transferred to a shadow system, one that existed parallel to Sterling Financial's official records. "Watch this," Richard said proudly, pulling up Mrs. Rodriguez's profile. 3 days ago, she signed up for our elite digital package. By tomorrow, her Social Security deposits will automatically split 60% to her visible account, 40% to a hidden investment fund she'll never see. The beauty is in the documentation, Helen added, spreading out papers on a nearby desk. Everything looks perfectly legitimate. We use the bank's real forms, real signatures, just modified in ways that give us complete access. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, the money's been moved through so many channels, it's untraceable. Alexander felt the room spin slightly. The scale of the fraud was staggering. Thousands of elderly clients, millions in stolen funds, all hidden behind the trusted facade of his father's bank. But what about oversight? He heard himself ask. Corporate audits. Xavier laughed. Who do you think designed the audit protocols? Victoria Hayes isn't just enabling us, she's our architect. Every random inspection, every regulatory review, it's all choreographed, the real records. Never see daylight. A large screen dominated one wall, displaying a map with pulsing dots representing sterling branches. 10 locations now, Xavier said proudly. By next quarter, we roll out to 50. Within a year, every major sterling branch will have a dedicated investment suite. The potential is limitless. As the presentation continued, Alexander noticed something that made his blood freeze. A familiar name appeared on one of the target lists. Margaret Wilson, his father's oldest friend, practically his aunt, who had cheered at his college graduation. They were targeting her substantial retirement fund next. Crawford, Helen's voice snapped him back. You look pale. I know it's a lot to take in, but remember, these people trust banks blindly. We're just redistributing resources they'll never miss. Besides, Richard added, it's not like they can stop us. Most of them can barely use an ATM. By the time families start asking questions, we've already moved on. Alexander's phone buzzed. Another message. Now you know. But tomorrow's executive visitors will show you who really benefits from Operation Golden Years. Be careful. They're starting to watch you more closely. Later that night, alone in his borrowed apartment, Alexander reviewed everything he'd learned. The basement operation wasn't just a rogue branch manager's scheme. It was a systematic enterprise endorsed at the highest levels of his bank. His father's legacy of trust had become the perfect weapon for exploitation. As he studied the documents he'd managed to photograph, a pattern emerged. The fraud was expanding exponentially, but it needed constant growth to hide its tracks. Like any pyramid scheme, it would eventually collapse. When it did, thousands of families would lose everything. His phone lit up one final time that night. Tomorrow's executive meeting. Watch the man who never speaks. He knows where all the bodies are buried, literally. Alexander stared at the message for a long time. The phrase triggered a memory. 3 years ago, an elderly client had died by suicide after losing his life savings in a failed investment. The incident had been blamed on poor record-keeping. Now he wondered, had that been the first test of Operation Golden Years? Tomorrow would bring the executive team, including Victoria Hayes. Alexander touched the fake glasses that had become his shield. His disguise had gotten him this far, but with every revelation, the stakes grew higher. One slip, one moment of recognition, and he wouldn't just lose his chance to expose the truth. He might lose everything, including his life. The executive team arrived in a convoy of black SUVs, their tinted windows reflecting the early morning sun. Alexander watched from his teller window as Victoria Hayes strode through the front doors, flanked by 3 board members he recognized from quarterly meetings. Behind them walked a man Alexander had never seen before, tall, thin, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they touched. Crawford! Helen's voice carried an edge of panic. Conference room! Now! They want to see yesterday's conversion numbers. The conference room had been transformed. Gone were the investment seminar banners, replaced by sophisticated financial projections. The elderly clients' photos that had decorated the walls were now hidden behind charts showing exponential growth. Victoria Hayes sat at the head of the table, her tailored suit and perfect posture radiating authority. Branch number 247 has exceeded all expectations, she announced. Richard, your team's methods will become our new standard. The silver-haired man remained standing, positioned in a corner where he could observe everyone. He hadn't spoken a word, but Alexander noticed how others in the room subtly oriented themselves away from him, like prey animals sensing a predator. Show them the Rodriguez account, Richard urged, practically glowing with pride. Crawford here helped close that deal. Alexander felt Hayes's sharp gaze land on him. Crawford, I don't recall that name from our personnel files. Recent transfer, Helen jumped in quickly. He's shown a remarkable aptitude for our special programs. Indeed. Hayes's smile didn't reach her eyes. Perhaps Mr. Crawford would like to explain his approach? Alexander's heart hammered as he stood. This was the moment. One wrong word could expose him. I simply help clients understand their options, he began carefully. Mrs. Rodriguez, for example, was concerned about her financial security. Spare us the ethical considerations, the silver-haired man spoke for the first time. His voice, carrying a slight European accent. Show us the numbers. Richard quickly pulled up Mrs. Rodriguez's account on the screen. The complex web of transfers and hidden fees drew appreciative nods from the board members, but Alexander noticed something in the documentation, a pattern he'd seen before in his father's old files. The routing structures, the silver-haired man commented, they're familiar. They should be, Mr. Klein, Hayes replied. We adapted them from the 08 crisis. Your old team's work, I believe? Klein. The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. Marcus Klein had been investigated after the 2008 financial crisis for elaborate fraud schemes, but had disappeared before charges could be filed. The official story was suicide. Obviously, that had been yet another deception. Operation Golden. Years is ready for national implementation, Hayes continued. With Klein's refinements, even federal auditors won't spot the patterns. Within 5 years, we'll have access to over $30 billion in retirement assets. Alexander's hands were shaking as he took notes. Klein's presence explained the sophistication of the fraud, but it also meant the conspiracy reached far beyond. Sterling Financial. His bank wasn't just being corrupted, it was being used as a weapon by the same predators who had nearly destroyed the financial system years ago. There is one small concern, Klein's cold eyes fixed on Alexander. Some of our analytics show anomalies in recent weeks, access patterns that don't match normal employee behavior. The room temperature seemed to drop. Alexander kept his expression neutral, but he could feel sweat building under his collar. Crawford, Klein addressed him directly. You've been accessing customer files outside your assigned portfolio, researching accounts that aren't part of the current operation. Why? Alexander's mind raced. His careful investigation had left digital footprints. I was studying successful conversions, he replied, forcing confidence into his voice, learning from past examples to improve my targeting. Interesting approach, Klein smiled thinly. Victoria, perhaps we should have Mr. Crawford join the special projects team at corporate. His initiative could be valuable. A promotion that was really a trap. If Alexander accepted, he'd be under direct surveillance. If he refused, he'd raise immediate suspicion. I'm honored, he began, but Hayes cut him off. First, we should review his personnel file more thoroughly. Recent transfers can be complicated. The message was clear. They would be investigating him. Alexander had at most 24 hours before his cover was blown. As the meeting concluded, Klein lingered behind. Alexander overheard his whispered conversation with Hayes. "If he's not who he claims to be, handle it quietly. We can't risk another Montgomery situation." Alexander's blood ran cold. Thomas Montgomery had been a junior auditor who died in an apparent robbery last year, shortly after flagging irregularities in several branch reports. His phone vibrated. One last warning. They know something's wrong. The next 24 hours will determine if Sterling Financial keeps its soul or loses it forever. But remember, Klein doesn't act alone. Someone much closer to you gave him the keys to the kingdom. Alexander looked around the conference room at the faces of people who had turned his father's dream into a nightmare. Tomorrow would bring either justice or ruin. The question was, could he expose the truth before Klein's people uncovered his? Alexander's fingers flew across his keyboard, processing routine transactions while his mind raced through possibilities. His team would be investigating his background, which meant his carefully constructed identity as Michael Crawford would unravel within hours. He needed to gather conclusive evidence before that happened. "Helen wants you in the investment suite." Richard's voice made him jump. "Apparently Mr. Klein was impressed. They're letting you handle the Wilson portfolio." Margaret Wilson, his father's friend. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. If he refused the assignment, he'd raise immediate suspicion. If he participated, he'd be directly implicated in the fraud. The investment suite felt colder than usual. Helen waited with a stack of documents, her usual brusque manner tinged with something else, respect or perhaps wariness. "Klein thinks you have potential," she said, sliding Margaret's file across the desk. "Show us he's right." Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he opened the file. Margaret's entire financial history lay before him. Mortgage documents, retirement accounts, medical records. They'd even obtained her recent cognitive assessment, noting early signs of memory issues. The thoroughness of their surveillance was chilling. "We've arranged for her to come in this afternoon," Helen explained. "The usual approach won't work. She's too sophisticated with finances. That's why we need your special touch." As Helen outlined their strategy, Alexander noticed a pattern in Margaret's recent transactions. Small inconsistencies, carefully hidden, suggested they'd already begun siphoning funds from her accounts. They weren't waiting for his conversion. This was a test of his loyalty. His phone buzzed silently. Another message. "Check the signature on the Wilson transfer authorizations. Some forgeries are signed by ghosts." Alexander's blood ran cold as he examined the documents more closely. The authorizing signatures weren't forgeries. They belonged to Thomas Montgomery, the dead auditor. They were dated after his death. "Everything all right, Crawford?" Helen's voice carried an edge. "Just being thorough," he replied, forcing a smile. "These high-value clients require special attention." The afternoon crawled by with excruciating slowness. Alexander processed routine transactions while covertly photographing evidence with his phone. Each document revealed new layers of the conspiracy: falsified audits, backdated transfers, forged authorizations. The fraud wasn't just sophisticated, it was architecturally beautiful in its complexity. At 3:30, Margaret Wilson walked into the bank. Alexander watched her greet the tellers with warm familiarity. She'd known most of them for years. Her elegant appearance and sharp eyes showed no signs of the cognitive decline noted in her file. "Mr. Crawford?" Helen appeared at his window. "Mrs. Wilson is ready for her consultation." The private office felt like a trap closing. Margaret sat across from him, her presence achingly familiar from countless family dinners and holiday celebrations. Would she recognize him through his disguise? "Now then," Margaret adjusted her reading glasses. Helen mentioned something about restructuring my investments. Alexander opened the folder containing the fraudulent documents, his mind racing. Every moment he spent here increased the risk of discovery, but Margaret's presence offered an unexpected opportunity. Mrs. Wilson, he began carefully, I'd like to review your recent transaction history first. Have you authorized any significant transfers in the past month? Certainly not, she frowned. My portfolio is quite conservatively managed. Alexander turned the monitor so she could see it. These transactions suggest otherwise. Margaret's expression shifted as she studied the screen. That's impossible. I never authorized... She stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing. Young man, your hands are shaking. Before Alexander could respond, a commotion erupted in the main lobby. Through the office window, he saw Victoria Hayes striding through the front doors, accompanied by 2 security officers. Helen was pointing toward the private offices. Mrs. Wilson, Alexander spoke quickly, dropping his fake voice. I need you to trust me. Your accounts have been compromised, but I can prove... Alexander, Margaret's eyes widened with recognition. My God, what are you... The office door burst open. Hayes stood in the doorway, her expression triumphant. Mr. Sterling, she said coldly, or should I say Mr. Crawford, I believe this charade has gone on long enough. But Margaret Wilson was already moving, her aristocratic demeanor transformed into steel. Victoria, perfect timing. Mr. Crawford here was just showing me some fascinating irregularities in my accounts. Perhaps you'd care to explain why I'm seeing transfers authorized by Thomas Montgomery 3 months after his death. The room froze. Hayes's face went blank. In that moment of confusion, Alexander's phone automatically uploaded all his gathered evidence to a secure server, a failsafe he'd prepared for exactly this scenario. Margaret, Hayes recovered smoothly, there's clearly been a misunderstanding. Why don't we discuss this in my office? I think not. Margaret's voice could have cut glass. In fact, I believe we should all wait right here for the FBI agents. I contacted this morning. They're particularly interested in discussing Operation Golden Years. Alexander stared at his father's old friend in dawning comprehension. The anonymous messages, the perfectly timed warnings. Margaret Wilson had been running her own investigation all along. Hayes's composure cracked. Security. Lock down the... But it was too late. Federal agents were already entering the bank, led by a familiar figure, Thomas Montgomery himself, very much alive and wearing an FBI badge. Hello, Victoria. Montgomery smiled grimly. We need to talk about some signatures you've been forging in my name. The bank lobby erupted into chaos. Security officers froze, uncertain whose orders to follow. Employees gathered at the edges of the room, watching their corporate leaders face off against federal agents. Through the glass doors, Alexander could see police vehicles surrounding the building. This is absurd. Hayes's voice remained steady, but her eyes darted toward the basement stairs. We have all proper authorizations, including mine. Montgomery stepped forward. That's interesting, considering I've been deep undercover for the past year, working with Mrs. Wilson to track Operation Golden Years across multiple banks. Klein appeared at the top of the basement stairs, his silver hair disheveled. Victoria, the servers. He stopped short at the sight of the FBI agents. Nobody moves. Montgomery's voice rang out. We have teams securing the basement facility now. Mr. Klein, I believe we still have an outstanding warrant for your arrest. From 2008, Alexander watched his father's bank transform into a crime scene. FBI cyber teams swarmed the basement, securing servers and documents. Employees were being interviewed, many breaking down in tears as they revealed how they'd been coerced into participating in the fraud. You don't understand what you're doing. Hayes turned to Alexander, her composure cracking. The whole financial system operates this way. We just perfected it. Your father— Don't you dare speak about my father. Alexander's voice was quiet, but carried across the silent lobby. He built this bank to protect people, not prey on them. Margaret Wilson stood beside him, her elegant posture unchanged, despite the chaos. When Thomas contacted me about suspicious patterns in elderly accounts, I couldn't believe it. But then I remembered what your father always said, Alexander, trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets. Richard and Helen were led past, in handcuffs, their earlier arrogance replaced by desperate bargaining. We can explain everything, Richard pleaded. It was all Hayes and Klein's idea. Klein's cold facade had shattered. This is impossible. Our security was perfect. How— Did you really think Mrs. Rodriguez came to the bank every Thursday by accident? Montgomery smiled. One of our best agents. She's been documenting your investment seminars for months. Alexander's mind reeled. The elderly woman he'd tried to protect had been an undercover agent all along. Every piece had been carefully orchestrated. Margaret Wilson's involvement, Montgomery's faked death, even the anonymous messages guiding Alexander's investigation. Though I must admit, Montgomery turned to Alexander, your appearance was an unexpected bonus. Having the CEO himself document everything from the inside? Priceless. The board will never let this go public. Hayes found her voice again. The damage to the banking system is exactly why this needs to be public. Alexander cut her off. He addressed the gathered employees directly. My father believed banking was about trust. Trust we've betrayed. Starting today, that changes. Over the next few hours, the full scope of Operation Golden Years emerged. The scheme had already stolen billions from elderly accounts across multiple banks. Klein's algorithms had been quietly embedded in financial systems throughout the industry, ready to be activated. We've got signed confessions from 3 other bank CEOs, Montgomery explained, as the last of the conspirators were led away. This wasn't just about Sterling Financial, it was about exploiting the entire banking system's blind spots. Mrs. Rodriguez, Agent Sarah Martinez, joined them, her disguise as an elderly victim discarded. The hardest part was watching the daily exploitation, she said. If it hadn't been for you choosing to investigate personally, Mr. Sterling, we might have missed the connection to Klein. As the day turned to evening, Alexander gathered the shell-shocked employees in the lobby. He removed his glasses and fake beard, fully revealing himself to his staff. I know many of you were forced into participating, he began. Some through threats, others through manipulation. Starting tomorrow, we begin rebuilding, not just accounts and systems, but trust. Every customer affected will be made whole. Every employee who helps us make this right will have a place in the new Sterling Financial. Margaret touched his arm gently. Your father would be proud, Alexander. Not just of stopping this, but of how you're handling what comes next. The next weeks were a blur of federal investigations, customer restitution, and media scrutiny. Alexander testified before Congress, laying bare how sophisticated financial fraud had evolved to target the elderly and vulnerable. Other banks, fearing discovery, began dismantling similar operations. Sterling Financial transformed. The investment suite became a financial literacy center, helping customers understand and protect their assets. Richard's old office was converted into a compliance monitoring station, staffed by former federal regulators. 6 months later, Alexander sat in his father's old office, reviewing customer satisfaction reports. The numbers were lower than during the fraud years, but they were real. On his desk sat a frame containing his father's favorite saying, "Banking is not about money, it's about people." Mrs. Rodriguez, Agent Martinez, had become the bank's new head of security, implementing protocols that made customer protection the highest priority. Margaret Wilson led a board committee on ethical banking practices, ensuring the reforms became permanent. The fake glasses that had helped him expose the truth now sat in a display case in the lobby, next to his father's original bank charter. A reminder that sometimes you have to step into the shadows to bring darkness to light. "Your next appointment is here," his assistant announced. "Another bank CEO wanting to discuss implementing our new ethical banking framework." Alexander smiled. The conspiracy had intended to transform banking into a weapon against the vulnerable. Instead, Sterling Financial was transforming banking back into what it should have been all along, a guardian of people's trust and dreams. The price of that transformation had been high, but as Alexander welcomed his visitor, he knew it had been worth every cost. His father's legacy wasn't just preserved, it was renewed, stronger than ever, built on a foundation of restored trust and genuine service to others. 1 year after Operation Golden Years crumbled, Alexander stood in the community room of Sterling Financial's branch NUP 247, now transformed into a bustling financial education center. The walls, once covered with predatory investment advertisements, now displayed success stories of customers who'd rebuilt their financial lives with the bank's help. "Mr. Sterling," a familiar voice called out. Mrs. Chen, Mr. Chen's widow, approached with a warm smile. Her husband had passed away shortly after the scandal broke, but Alexander had personally ensured that every penny stolen from their accounts was restored to her family. Now she volunteered 3 days a week, helping other elderly immigrants navigate their banking decisions. "The new senior protection program is working beautifully," she reported proudly. "We've already helped 50 families avoid investment scams this month alone." The branch that had once been the epicenter of corruption had become a model for ethical banking nationwide. Every morning, before regular business hours, the community room hosted free financial literacy classes. Former victims of Operation Golden Years, like Mrs. Chen, had become educators and advocates. Alexander watched as Helen, recently released from prison, walked through the doors. Part of her plea deal included community service, teaching other bankers about the warning signs of institutional fraud. Her expertise in spotting vulnerabilities now served to prevent exploitation rather than enable it. "The hardest part," Helen told her classes, "is recognizing how easy it is to justify unethical behavior when it's wrapped in corporate policies and profit metrics. One compromise leads to another until you wake up one day and don't recognize yourself." The bank's transformation had rippled through the entire financial industry. The Sterling standards, as they became known, were being adopted by banks worldwide. Regular staff rotations, enhanced elderly protections, and transparent fee structures became the new normal. Thomas Montgomery, now running the FBI's specialized banking crimes division, visited frequently to study their evolving security measures. "What you've built here," he told Alexander during one such visit, "is more than just a bank. It's a blueprint for reform." The basement that had housed Operation Golden Years was now the home of Sterling's Innovation Lab, where tech experts worked alongside senior advocates to develop age-friendly banking apps and fraud detection systems. Margaret Wilson, despite attempts to retire, led the advisory board, ensuring all innovations prioritized customer protection over profit. "Your father always said banking should be a bridge, not a barrier," Margaret reminded Alexander during their weekly lunches. "Now you've shown the world how to build that bridge." Not everything had been smooth. Some board members resigned rather than embrace the new direction. Profits initially dropped as predatory fees were eliminated. But gradually, something remarkable happened. Customer trust began driving sustainable growth. People actively moved their accounts to Sterling, drawn by its commitment to ethical banking. Agent Martinez, formerly Mrs. Rodriguez, had established a nationwide training program for bank employees, teaching them to spot and prevent elder financial abuse. Her Rodriguez protocol for handling vulnerable customers became required training at every major bank. "We never just needed better rules," she explained to new recruits. "We needed a complete culture change. Sterling Financial proved it was possible." The most profound changes were often the smallest ones. Alexander maintained his practice of working regular shifts as a teller, staying connected to the daily reality of banking. Every executive in his company did the same. From board members to department heads, Richard's old office had become a customer advocacy center where Ms. Thompson, a former victim of the investment scams, now led a team dedicated to resolving customer issues. The center's motto, prominently displayed, read, "Trust is our most valuable asset." Klein's sophisticated fraud algorithms hadn't been destroyed. They'd been reversed, reprogrammed to protect rather than exploit. The same AI that once identified vulnerable targets now flagged suspicious patterns and potential exploitation attempts across the entire banking network. On the anniversary of Operation Golden Year's exposure, Alexander received an unexpected visitor, Victoria Hayes's daughter. She'd come to return her mother's executive bonus from the scheme years, asking that it be added to the Victim Restitution Fund. "Mum finally told me everything," she said quietly. "She wanted you to know that watching Sterling Financial's transformation from prison helped her understand what banking should have been all along." That evening, after the bank closed, Alexander wandered through the building that had seen both the worst and best of human nature. In the lobby, beside his fake glasses, he'd added a new display, a wall of letters from customers sharing how Sterling's reforms had protected their families' futures. The next morning would bring new challenges. Other banks were still struggling with the temptation of exploitation. Financial predators constantly evolved their tactics, but Sterling Financial had evolved too, from a mere bank into a guardian of public trust. As Alexander prepared to leave, he noticed a young teller helping an elderly customer understand his new account features. The care and patience in their interaction reflected everything he'd fought to rebuild. His phone buzzed. Not an anonymous warning this time, but a message from Margaret Wilson. "Your father used to say a bank is only as strong as its principles. Today, Sterling Financial's principles are stronger than ever." Alexander smiled. Touching the worn name tag he kept in his pocket, Michael Crawford had been retired, but the lessons learned through that identity lived on in every aspect of Sterling's renewed mission. The bank hadn't just survived its darkest chapter, it had emerged as a beacon of what financial institutions could and should be. The fake glasses in the lobby display caught the evening light, a reminder that sometimes the clearest vision comes when we change our perspective. Sterling Financial's story had become more than a cautionary tale. It was now a roadmap for transforming an industry, one ethical decision at a time. The morning after the FBI raid, Alexander arrived at branch, the 247 to find a scene of controlled chaos. Federal agents swarmed the basement, extracting servers and boxes of documents. But it was the arrival of Benjamin Parker, director of Sterling's West Coast operations, that made his blood run cold. "Quite a show you've put on, Alex." Parker's casual tone belied the tension in his shoulders. "But did you really think Klein's operation was limited to one region?" Before Alexander could respond, Montgomery pulled him aside. "We need to talk in private." The FBI agent led him to a secure conference room where satellite images and financial charts covered the walls. "Operation Golden Years wasn't just a local scheme," Montgomery explained, pointing to a complex web of transactions. "It's a test, run for something bigger. Klein's algorithms are already embedded in banking systems across the country, dormant but ready. Branch number 247 was just the prototype. The evidence was staggering. Shell companies linked to Parker had been funneling elderly victims' money through a maze of international accounts. Each transfer was fractional, nearly impossible to trace unless you knew where to look. That's why Hayes seemed so confident, Alexander realized. They knew that, even if one branch was exposed, the network would survive. Montgomery finished. Klein's real masterpiece isn't the fraud itself, it's how deep he's buried it in the banking infrastructure. A junior agent burst into the room. "Sir, we found something in Parker's communications. Project Eclipse?" Montgomery's face darkened. "That's what we were afraid of. Project Eclipse is Klein's endgame, a coordinated attack on retirement accounts across the entire banking sector. Once activated, it would trigger simultaneous transfers from thousands of elderly accounts, all technically authorized through compromised systems." Alexander studied the project details, his horror growing. The scheme made Operation Golden Years look amateur by comparison. It wasn't just about stealing money, it was about hijacking the very infrastructure of trust that banking depended on. Parker's here to clean up, Alexander realized, to ensure nothing leads back to the wider network. Exactly, Montgomery agreed. And he's not alone. We've identified at least 12 other bank executives involved, but we can't move on them without proof. A familiar voice interrupted them. "Perhaps I can help with that." Margaret Wilson stood in the doorway, holding an ancient-looking ledger. "Your father kept detailed records, Alexander, including some very interesting notes about Benjamin Parker's early career." The ledger contained more than just transaction records. Alexander's father had documented suspicious patterns dating back 15 years, including Parker's gradual rise through the banking ranks. Dad knew something was wrong, Alexander breathed, touching his father's handwriting. He was building a case. A case that got him pushed into early retirement, Margaret added grimly. The board claimed it was for health reasons, but he never believed that. As they dug deeper into the ledger, a pattern emerged. Parker hadn't just enabled Klein's operations. He'd been instrumental in their design, using lessons learned from smaller schemes at regional banks. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the conference room window, they watched as Parker was escorted from his office by FBI agents. His composure cracked when he saw Alexander with the ledger. "You're making a mistake," Parker called out. "The whole system depends on what we built. You'll destroy everything." "No," Alexander replied, loud enough for the gathering employees to hear. "We're going to rebuild it, the right way this time." But as Parker was led away, Alexander's phone lit up with an alert. Someone had just initiated a massive funds transfer from the bank's senior accounts. The first phase of Project Eclipse had begun. "They're activating it early," Montgomery grabbed his radio. "Parker must have had a fail-safe." Alexander raced to his office where Mrs. Chen was already at his computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The gentle, elderly volunteer was gone, replaced by a focused cybersecurity expert. "The transfers are automated," she explained rapidly. "Klein's algorithm is like a virus, spreading through connected banking systems. We need to quarantine Sterling Financial immediately." "That would mean shutting down all operations," Alexander protested. "Thousands of legitimate transactions." "Will be delayed," Margaret finished firmly. "Better than having them stolen." The next hour was a blur of emergency protocols and system overrides. Alexander had to make the hardest call of his career, ordering a complete shutdown of Sterling Financial's network. The ripple effects would be felt throughout the banking sector, but the alternative was unthinkable. As brokers and investors panicked and reporters gathered outside, Alexander stood in the lobby of branch NAS 247, watching his father's bank go dark for the first time in its history. But in that darkness lay their best chance to expose and eliminate Klein's hidden network once and for all. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The eclipse can't happen if you turn on all the lights, but be careful. Some shadows bite back. The emergency command center had been set up in the bank's main conference room. Screens displayed real-time updates from Sterling Financial's branches across the country, most now showing ominous red error messages. Alexander stood at the center of the storm, surrounded by FBI cyber experts and his own tech team. Project Eclipse isn't just transferring funds, Mrs. Chen, or Agent Lisa Chen as she'd been revealed, explained, pointing to cascading lines of code. It's rewriting transaction histories, creating a perfect cover story for each theft. By the time regular auditing would catch it, the money would be untraceable. "We've got incoming," Montgomery announced, hanging up his phone. "The Federal Reserve is demanding an explanation for the shutdown. Treasury departments on high alert, and the other major banks are starting to detect similar intrusions in their systems." Alexander's decision to shut down Sterling Financial had sent shockwaves through the financial sector. Stock markets were wobbling, and conspiracy theories were already spreading online about bank collapses and government takeovers. "Sir," a young tech analyst called out, "we're seeing attempts to breach our firewalls, multiple access points, trying to force a remote restart." On the main screen, a map of the United States lit up with red dots. Other banks where Klein's algorithms had been lying dormant, now awakening in response to Sterling's shutdown. The infection was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. "They're using our own security protocols against us," Agent Chen muttered. "Every bank system is programmed to automatically sync with partner institutions. Project Eclipse isn't just hiding in the code, it's become part of the infrastructure." A familiar face appeared on one of the video feeds. James Morrison, CEO of Western Alliance Bank, one of Sterling's biggest competitors. "Alexander, what the hell are you doing? Your shutdown is causing panic. We're seeing runs on branches in 3 states. "Jim, listen carefully." Alexander leaned toward the camera. "Check your senior accounts, specifically any automated investment programs. You'll find—" The feed cut off abruptly. Moments later, alerts began blaring from multiple screens. "Western Alliance just initiated a full system reset," Agent Chen reported grimly. "They're trying to force their network back online. If they succeed, Project Eclipse will have a direct path into their accounts," Montgomery finished. "We need to stop that reset." Alexander grabbed his phone, dialing Morrison's private number. No answer. He tried the bank's board members, executives, anyone who might have override authority. Nothing. "Wait," he paused, a memory surfacing. Dad's ledger. Morrison was on the board when Parker started his rise. What if he's not just panicking? What if he's part of it? Margaret Wilson was already flipping through the old ledger. Here, frequent meetings between Morrison and Parker, always off the books. Campaign contributions to the same shell companies. "Sir," the tech analyst interrupted. "Western Alliance's reset is triggering automated responses from other banks. The whole network is trying to reactivate." Alexander felt the weight of the moment. His next decision would either save the banking system or be remembered as the trigger for its collapse. The faces around him, FBI agents, bank employees, tech experts, all waited for his call. "Can we send an emergency override?" he asked Agent Chen. "Theoretically, yes, but we'd need direct access to each bank's core systems, authorization, codes that only their CEOs would have." "Or," Alexander smiled grimly, "authorization codes that a trusted partner bank would have for emergency scenarios." He pulled out his father's old keychain, a simple USB drive dangling from it. Dad always said to keep a backup of the backup. The drive contained more than just codes. It held the original banking protocols his father had helped design, the foundation that modern banking security was built on. And buried in that foundation was an emergency system meant to prevent exactly this kind of cascading failure. "It's a kill switch," Agent Chen breathed, examining the code. "Your father built a kill switch into the entire network, but using it would shut down every connected bank simultaneously." Alexander nodded. "A complete system reset. The market chaos would be unprecedented," Montgomery warned. "We're talking billions in losses, maybe even a global financial panic. Better than letting clients steal trillions and destroy faith in banking forever." Alexander's phone lit up with another message. "The eclipse is coming. Some fires have to burn for the truth to shine through." Outside the conference room windows, he could see news vans arriving, their lights illuminating the growing crowd of worried customers. His father's bank, every bank, had been built on trust. Now he had to break that trust to save it. "Do it," he ordered. Agent Chen's fingers flew across the keyboard, implementing the kill switch. Across the country, banks went dark one by one, their systems forced into emergency shutdown. The financial heart of the nation stopped beating, but in that stillness lay their only hope of cutting out the cancer Klein had planted. As the screens went dark around him, Alexander thought of his father's words. "Sometimes banking isn't about keeping the lights on. It's about being brave enough to work in the dark until dawn." The question was, what would they find when the lights came back on? The first hour after the national banking shutdown felt like a descent into financial apocalypse. Emergency generators hummed throughout Sterling Financial's headquarters as Alexander and his team worked by the glow of backup systems. Outside, the evening sky flickered with news helicopters, their searchlights cutting through the growing darkness. "Associated Press is running with the story," Montgomery reported, scanning updates on his government-secured phone. "Stock exchanges worldwide are suspending trading. The Fed chairman is being rushed back from Tokyo." Alexander stood at the window, watching the scenes unfold below. Police had set up barricades to control the crowds gathering outside major banks. The sidewalks were filling with people trying to photograph empty ATM screens and darkened bank lobbies with their phones. "Mr. Sterling," a young analyst burst into the room. "You need to see this. We're picking up unusual data traffic, even with the main systems down." On a backup monitor, they watched strings of code scroll past. Agent Chen leaned in, her expression grim. "It's Klein's algorithm, but it's evolving. The shutdown didn't stop it. It forced it to adapt." "How is that possible?" Alexander demanded. "Everything's offline." "Not everything," Margaret Wilson's voice carried from the doorway. She held up her smartphone. "Mobile banking apps, they're still trying to sync, still carrying fragments of the infected code. Every phone that has a banking app installed is now potentially part of Klein's network." The realization hit Alexander like a physical blow. In trying to stop the digital epidemic, they'd forced it to go viral in a way nobody had anticipated. Millions of phones, all carrying pieces of Project Eclipse, ready to reinfect the banking system the moment it came back online. "We need to get a message out," he decided. "Tell everyone to delete their banking apps immediately." "That could cause even more panic," Montgomery warned. "More than having their life savings stolen?" Alexander countered. He turned to the FBI's media liaison. "Get me a live feed. Every network, every platform. People need to know what they're carrying in their pockets." As the media team set up, Alexander received an urgent call from an unexpected source, Secretary of the Treasury William Nash. "Sterling, you better have one hell of an explanation for this shutdown. Sir, we've uncovered a massive fraud scheme that's infiltrated the entire banking system. Klein's algorithm." "Marcus Klein!" The secretary's voice sharpened. "He's dead, has been for years." "No, sir. He's very much alive, and he's built something that could destroy our entire financial infrastructure. The shutdown was the only way to To create nationwide panic? To potentially trigger a global financial crisis? Nash's tone was ice. You've overstepped, Sterling. The Treasury Department is officially taking control of this situation. Stand down. Alexander's instincts flared, something in Nash's voice. Sir, did you ever work with Benjamin Parker at First National? The slight pause before Nash's denial confirmed Alexander's suspicion. He muted the call and turned to Montgomery. Check Nash's connections to Parker and Klein. The Treasury Secretary might be compromised. As the FBI team dug into Nash's background, Alexander faced the assembled media. Cameras live-streamed his image to anxious viewers worldwide. Behind him, the darkened bank lobby served as a stark backdrop. My name is Alexander Sterling, CEO of Sterling Financial. Tonight, I ordered an emergency shutdown of our entire banking network, an action that has triggered a nationwide banking unfreeze. I know you're scared, I know you're angry, but what I'm about to tell you is more frightening than temporary bank closures. He explained Project Eclipse in terms everyone could understand, a digital virus targeting the elderly, hiding in the very apps people trusted with their money. As he spoke, his team was tracking a massive spike in banking app deletions across the country. Mr. Sterling, a reporter called out, Treasury Secretary Nash just issued a statement calling your actions reckless and unauthorized. He's ordering an immediate system restart. Before Alexander could respond, Agent Chen's voice cut through the chaos. Sir, we found it, Nash's name in Parker's private files. He was part of Klein's original team in '08. The Treasury Secretary is trying to force a restart because he's one of them. The revelation hit the live broadcasts like a bombshell. Within minutes, social media exploded with archived photos showing Nash at private meetings with Klein and Parker years ago. The conspiracy was unraveling in real time. Alexander's phone lit up with a new message. You've exposed the puppet masters, but watch out for the strings. Some threads lead to places even darkness fears to go. As federal agents rushed to confront Nash, Alexander gathered his core team. The banking system was still dark, Klein's algorithm was evolving through mobile networks, and now they discovered corruption reaching into the highest levels of government. What's our next move? Montgomery asked. Alexander held up his father's USB drive. We follow the money. Dad didn't just build a kill switch, he left breadcrumbs. Klein's algorithm had to come from somewhere. We find its origin. We find out who's really behind all this. Outside, the city's lights reflected off the dark bank windows, creating ghostly images of the crowds below. They were about to dive into waters far deeper and darker than anyone had imagined. The question wasn't just about saving the banking system anymore. It was about exposing a conspiracy that had been growing in the shadows for decades. The Sterling Financial Executive Boardroom had been transformed into a war room. Alexander's father's ledger lay open in the center of the table, surrounded by stacks of old files and documents recovered from the bank's archives. Agent Chen had connected his father's USB drive to a secure, isolated system, its contents projected onto the wall. Your father's coding style was unique, Agent Chen remarked, scrolling through lines of programming. He built backdoors into backdoors, security systems that looked like vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities that were actually traps. The question is, Montgomery added, was he trying to catch someone specific? Margaret Wilson carefully turned a page in the ledger. Look at these entries from 2007. Robert was tracking unusual patterns in senior account management across multiple banks. He'd noted similar code appearing in different institutions' systems. Alexander studied the dates. That was right before Klein's supposed death. Dad was onto something. More than something, Agent Chen's voice tensed with excitement. These code fragments your father documented. They're early versions of Klein's algorithm. But look at the signature buried in the base code. The projection showed a complex string of characters that meant nothing to most people in the room. But Margaret Wilson gasped. "Blackstar Banking Solutions," she whispered. "That was Walter Sterling's company, your grandfather's." Alexander's grandfather had been a pioneer in banking software development during the early days of digital finance. His company had created many of the foundational systems still used in modern banking. Klein didn't create the algorithm, Alexander realized. He stole it from my family. A deeper search through his father's files revealed a disturbing pattern. Walter Sterling had developed the original code as a security system, a way to track and prevent exploitation of vulnerable accounts. But after his mysterious death in a car accident, Blackstar Banking Solutions was broken up and sold off in pieces. "Look who handled the acquisition," Montgomery pointed to a document. "Quantum Financial Holdings, CEO, James Morrison." Morrison, the same Morrison who tried to force Western Alliance's systems back online? It gets better. Agent Chen pulled up more records. Quantum Financial was a shell company. Its primary shareholders included Klein, Parker, and guess who else? William Nash. The pieces were falling into place. Klein and his associates hadn't just stolen the algorithm. They'd systematically dismantled and buried Alexander's grandfather's company to hide their tracks. Then they'd twisted his protection system into a tool for exploitation. "Dad figured it out," Alexander said softly, touching his father's handwriting. "That's why they forced him into early retirement. He was getting too close." A hidden folder on the USB drive contained encrypted video files. With trembling hands, Alexander opened the first one. His father's face filled the screen, looking older and more tired than he remembered. "Alex, if you're watching this, then you've discovered what I couldn't prove. Blackstar's code was never meant to be a weapon. Your grandfather built it to protect people. But Klein and his partners, they saw its potential for something darker. They've spent years embedding corrupted versions into banking systems worldwide, waiting for the right moment to activate them all." The video continued, detailing how Robert Sterling had discovered the conspiracy but couldn't stop it. Every time he got close to exposing the truth, more evidence would vanish. More witnesses would go silent. "The key to stopping them is hidden. In plain sight," Robert's recorded image continued. "Klein's algorithm has a fatal flaw, one your grandfather built into its core. A kill switch that can't be removed without destroying the entire system. I've spent years tracking down all the pieces. They're scattered through the ledger, hidden in the numbers. Find them, Alex. Finish what your grandfather started." As the video ended, Alexander turned to Agent Chen. "How long would it take you to reconstruct the kill switch if we find all the pieces?" "Hours, maybe days. But Klein's algorithm is still evolving through the mobile networks. We might not have that much time." Montgomery's phone buzzed. "Nash is in custody, but he's not talking, and Morrison has disappeared. Private jet took off from LaGuardia an hour ago." "They're running," Margaret observed. "Which means, doom, they're getting ready to trigger something big," Alexander finished. "Project Eclipse was never just about stealing money. It's about destroying the evidence of what they stole years ago. My grandfather's legacy." A new message appeared on his phone. "Some family trees have roots in darker soil. Follow the money back to Blackstar. But hurry, the eclipse is almost total." Alexander looked around the room at his unlikely team. An FBI agent, a cybersecurity expert posing as an elderly immigrant, his father's closest friend, and dozens of dedicated analysts. Together, they had to reconstruct a decades-old kill switch while preventing a global financial catastrophe and exposing a conspiracy that had already claimed at least one Sterling's life. Dad protected his discovery the only way he could, Alexander realized, by hiding it in plain sight, in the one place Klein and his people would never think to look, the daily operations of a simple community bank. As they dove back into the ledger's mysterious numbers, Alexander felt the weight of 3 generations of sterling bankers on his shoulders. His grandfather had built a system to protect the vulnerable. His father had sacrificed his career to expose its theft. Now, it fell to him to make it right. "There's a pattern here," Agent Chen muttered, comparing 2 pages of the ledger spread across her workstation. The boardroom had been operating for 16 straight hours, fueled by coffee and determination. Your father didn't just record transactions, he embedded code fragments into routine banking entries. Alexander leaned over her shoulder, studying. The columns of numbers that had once seemed like ordinary accounting. Now he saw what his father had done, using decimal places and account numbers to hide pieces of the original Black Star algorithm. "Look at these service charge entries," Margaret pointed out. "They're all slightly off by exactly 3 cents. When you convert the differences to ASCII code, they spell out programming commands," Agent Chen finished. "Brilliant." He hid the kill switch in plain sight, disguised as mundane banking errors. Montgomery burst into the room, his usually composed demeanor shaken. "We've got problems, big ones. The mobile banking infection is mutating faster than we can track. It's not just carrying Klein's code anymore, it's actively rewriting itself." The main screen showed a map of reported banking anomalies spreading across time zones. Even with the major systems shut down, the infection was finding new paths through smartphones, payment apps, and digital wallets. "Sir," a junior analyst called out, "we're seeing unauthorized access attempts at ATMs worldwide. The algorithm is trying to bridge the gap between digital and physical banking." Alexander watched the attack patterns evolve in real time. Each blocked attempt seemed to teach the algorithm new ways to probe for weaknesses. His grandfather's protective system had been twisted into something that could think, adapt, and hunt. "Morrison's jet landed in Zurich," another agent reported. "Swiss authorities lost him in the financial district, but they did catch this on security cameras." The footage showed Morrison meeting briefly with a familiar silver-haired figure, Klein himself. The handoff was quick, a small hard drive changing hands. "They're going to try to sell it," Alexander realized. "The original Black Star code. Every criminal organization, every rogue state would pay fortunes for an algorithm that can hijack the global banking system." "Wait," Agent Chen straightened suddenly. "These account numbers from 2009, they're not account numbers at all. They're GPS coordinates." The team quickly plotted the hidden coordinates. They formed a trail leading through various financial districts, ending at an abandoned Black Star facility outside Boston. "Dad wasn't just documenting the fraud," Alexander said. "He was tracking the physical location of his father's original servers. The ones Klein's team stole." Margaret Wilson was already reaching for her phone. "I remember that facility. Walter was so proud of it. Said he kept his most important work there. But after his death, everything disappeared during the quantum financial takeover." "Not everything," Alexander corrected. "Dad's notes suggest some of the original hardware is still there, hidden in a sub-basement. If we can access it, we might find the unaltered version of your grandfather's code." Agent Chen finished. "The pure protection system, before Klein corrupted it." But as they prepared to move, the screens erupted with new alerts. The algorithm had found another vector, cryptocurrency exchanges. By infiltrating blockchain networks, it was creating shadow transactions that could survive even a complete banking shutdown. "It's learning from every defense we throw at it," Montgomery said grimly. "Your grandfather built it too well. The protection protocols are now protecting the virus itself, making it nearly impossible to destroy." Alexander's phone lit up. "Time is a circle. The eclipse begins where it ends, in the darkness beneath Black Star. But hurry. Some shadows are hungry." The message was accompanied by a photo, recent surveillance footage of Klein and Morrison entering the old Black Star facility. They're going to destroy the evidence, Alexander realized. Everything my grandfather and father worked to preserve. I'm scrambling teams to Boston now, Montgomery began, but Alexander cut him off. No, this is personal, sterling business. Klein used my family's work to hurt people. I need to be there when we take it back. You realize it's probably a trap, Agent Chen warned. Of course it is, Alexander smiled grimly. That's why we're going to spring it. Dad spent years documenting their methods. Now we use their own tactics against them. As the team mobilized, Alexander took one last look at his father's ledger. Hidden in those pages was more than just code. It was a testament to one man's relentless pursuit of truth, protected and passed down in the language of banking itself. Margaret, I need you to coordinate from here. Agent Chen, you're with me. And Montgomery, how fast can you get us to Boston? The FBI agent held up a set of keys. Choppers waiting on the roof. But Alexander, if Klein really is there, then it's time to end what began with my grandfather's death, Alexander finished. One way or another, the Sterling family's code stops hurting people tonight. The FBI helicopter cut through the night sky over Boston's outskirts. Its rotors, barely audible thanks to specialized stealth technology. Alexander studied his grandfather's facility through night vision binoculars. The abandoned Black Star building stood like a technological gravestone, a 5-story monument to fallen innovation. Security cameras are still active, Agent Chen noted, monitoring signals on her laptop. Running on an isolated power grid, someone's been maintaining this place. 3 heat signatures in the main building, Montgomery reported from the pilot's seat. 2 more patrolling the perimeter, professional patterns, private military contractors. Alexander remembered visiting this place as a child. His grandfather had shown him the research labs where banking's future was being shaped. The sub-basement. Access isn't on any official blueprints, he explained. Dad mentioned a hidden elevator in the old development wing, which is exactly where one of those heat signatures is currently stationed, Agent Chen pointed out. They know about it. The helicopter touched down 2 blocks away, behind an abandoned warehouse. As they geared up, Alexander's phone vibrated with a message from Margaret. Walter's old security chief just called. The sub-basement has a secondary entrance through the drainage system, sending coordinates. They're expecting us to go in from above, Montgomery mused. Classic Klein. Control the obvious approaches. The drainage tunnel was narrow and partially flooded. As they waded through knee-deep water, Alexander's mind raced with memories. His grandfather's voice echoed from decades past. Banking isn't about money, Alex. It's about trust. Break that trust and you break society itself. Agent Chen's hand signal stopped them. Ahead, fresh boot prints led up a maintenance ladder. Recent activity, she whispered, within the hour. They emerged into a dimly lit corridor lined with old server racks. The air hummed with active electronics. This section of the facility was very much alive. Listen, Alexander held up his hand. Through the walls came a faint rhythmic sound. Old tape drives. Dad said grandfather kept his most critical work on magnetic storage, harder to hack than networked systems. Multiple targets converging on the server room, Montgomery whispered, checking his thermal scanner. They're coordinated, moving in pairs. A voice echoed through the corridors, cultured, European, hauntingly familiar. Klein. I know you're here, Alexander. Your father had the same predictable sense of responsibility. Come, let me show you what your grandfather really built. Agent Chen's tablet lit up with warnings. The algorithm spreading faster topside. Whatever they're doing here is accelerating its evolution. They crept closer to the server room, using the obsolete equipment as cover. Through gaps in the racks, Alexander caught glimpses of modern hardware patched into the ancient systems. Klein's team was mining the old code, feeding it into their corrupted version. "Your grandfather was brilliant," Klein's voice continued, closer now. "He saw banking's digital future decades ahead of anyone else. But he was a fool. He thought his code could protect people from themselves. I simply repurposed it." "To steal from the elderly?" Alexander called out, drawing their attention while Agent Chen circled around. "To exploit the vulnerable?" Klein's laugh was chilling. "To expose the truth. People trust banks blindly, generation after generation. They deserve to learn how misplaced that trust is." Alexander caught a glimpse of Morrison working frantically at a terminal, while armed guards watched the approaches. Klein stood calmly in the center, his silver hair gleaming under emergency lights. "Did my grandfather learn that truth before you killed him?" Alexander's voice was steel. "Walter's death was unfortunate. He refused to see the potential in his own creation. Rather like your father." A guard's radio crackled. "Sir, we've got FBI vehicles approaching from the north." "Right on schedule," Klein smiled. "Morrison, download status? 90% complete. Original Black Star code successfully integrated. Project Eclipse is evolving beyond projections." Alexander realized with horror what they'd done. By bringing his father's kill switch to the facility, they'd inadvertently delivered the final piece Klein needed. The original protection system wasn't just being corrupted, it was being absorbed, making the algorithm virtually unstoppable. "Your grandfather built a shield," Klein explained, almost gentle. "I've turned it into a sword. When Project Eclipse fully activates, it won't just steal, it will destroy trust in digital banking forever. A global financial reset with us controlling the new system." A shadow moved behind the servers. Agent Chen was in position. Alexander met Montgomery's eyes. They had one chance to stop this. "You forgot something about the Sterling family." Alexander stepped into view, hands raised. "We believe in backup plans." The server room's lights suddenly flashed red. Klein's smile faltered as ancient warning systems roared to life. On every screen, a familiar message appeared. The same ASCII code Robert Sterling had hidden in his ledger. The Black Star facility had awakened, and it recognized its true owners. Ancient machinery groaned to life around them as Walter Sterling's original security protocols activated. Blast doors slammed shut, sealing the server room. The modern equipment Klein's team had installed began shutting down, screen by screen. "What have you done?" Klein's composure cracked. "Morrison!" "The system's rejecting our access." Morrison's fingers flew across his keyboard. It's reverting to original protocols. Everything we've uploaded is being quarantined." Agent Chen emerged from behind the servers, weapon raised. "FBI, everyone on the ground!" The guards moved to react, but Klein raised his hand, stopping them. His smile had returned, colder than ever. "You don't understand what you've done. Alexander, Project Eclipse isn't just in these servers anymore. It's alive in the global network. Your grandfather's facility is irrelevant now." "Is it?" Alexander moved to an ancient terminal, its green screen still glowing. "Dad's message led us here for a reason. This wasn't just about stopping you from stealing more code." His fingers found the keys, muscle memory from childhood visits guiding them. His grandfather had taught him this system, made him practice until the commands were instinct. "Banking is about trust," he'd said, "and trust requires guardians." The screen responded to his input, displaying lines of original Black Star code. But this wasn't the protection algorithm Klein had stolen. This was something else. "That's impossible," Morrison breathed, watching Alexander's terminal. "That's root-level access, the original Black Star command structure." "My grandfather built this system," Alexander kept typing. "Did you really think he wouldn't leave a way to protect it?" Everything you stole was a surface layer. The real heart of Black Star stayed locked away, waiting for a Sterling to wake it up. Klein's face contorted. "Shoot him! Now!" Gunfire erupted in the server room. Alexander dove behind a bank of computers as bullets sparked off metal. Agent Chen returned fire, forcing the guards into cover. Montgomery's voice crackled over their earpieces. "Backup's 5 minutes out. Hold your position." But Alexander couldn't wait. On his terminal, the facility's true purpose was revealing itself. Black Star hadn't just been a software company. It was a monitoring system for the entire banking sector. Walter Sterling had created a hidden framework that could track and counter any attempt to exploit digital banking on a mass scale. "The algorithm's spreading faster," Morrison shouted over the gunfire. "Global infection rate at 60%. "Let it spread," Klein laughed. "Every infected system becomes part of our network. Your grandfather's facility can't stop what's already begun." "No," Alexander smiled, entering the final command. "But it can lead us to every compromised system. Dad didn't hide the kill switch in his ledger. He hid the key to finding all of your infected nodes." The ancient screens flickered to life, displaying a global map. Thousands of points of light represented banking systems carrying Klein's corrupted code. As they watched, the lights began pulsing in sequence. "What's happening?" Klein demanded. "Black Star is calling home," Agent Chen understood first. "Every piece of code your team stole had a dormant signature. By activating the original system, we've lit up your entire network," Alexander finished. "Every bank, every system, every device running your stolen algorithm is now broadcasting its location to federal cybercrime units worldwide." Morrison's tablet erupted with alerts. "They're rolling up our nodes in Europe. Asia's going dark. The algorithm. It's being trapped, isolated." "The people you stole from?" Alexander stood, facing Klein. "The elderly victims you targeted. They all use banking systems built on my grandfather's foundation. He designed it to protect them, not just their money, their trust." Klein moved with unexpected speed, drawing a concealed weapon. "Progress requires sacrifice, Alexander. Your grandfather never understood that, just like your father never understood why he had to be silenced." The admission hung in the air. Alexander's hands tightened on the terminal. "You killed him?" "A convenient accident, just like your grandfather's. Banking evolution requires pruning of old growth." But Klein had made a fatal mistake. Focused on Alexander, he'd forgotten about Agent Chen. Her shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. His gun clattered across the floor as FBI teams breached the blast doors. Morrison tried to run, but slipped in the chaos, cracking his head on a server rack. The guards, seeing their position overrun, surrendered. As federal agents swarmed the facility, Alexander returned to his terminal. The map showed Klein's network collapsing worldwide. Every system his team had infected was being identified and cleaned. The stolen algorithm, cut off from its command structure, was dissolving. "Sir," a young FBI tech called out, "we found something else in the sub-basement. Video files, hundreds of them." The footage revealed the full scope of Klein's operation. Decades of systematic theft and exploitation, all documented by Walter Sterling's hidden systems. The evidence would dismantle not just Klein's empire, but expose dozens of corrupt banking executives worldwide. "Your father knew," Agent Chen said softly. "That's why he kept investigating, even after they forced him out. He was waiting for the right moment to activate your grandfather's failsafe." Alexander touched the ancient terminal one last time. In the end, 3 generations of Sterling bankers had worked together across time, one building the protection, one preserving its secret, and one finally bringing it to light. But as he watched Klein being led away, Alexander knew this wasn't over. Banking evolution did require change, not the devastating kind Klein had pursued, but the kind his grandfather had envisioned, a system where trust wasn't just protected by code, but by people who remembered what that trust really meant. The sunrise painted Boston's skyline in shades of gold as federal teams continued to process the Black Star facility. Alexander stood in his grandfather's old office, now a time capsule of banking history. Dusty awards and faded photographs lined the walls, telling the story of a visionary who tried to protect the future. "Preliminary reports are coming in," Agent Chen announced, tablet in hand. "The algorithm's been isolated in over 80% of affected systems. Global banking networks are starting to come back online, clean and secured." But it was another discovery that caught Alexander's attention. Behind his grandfather's desk, he found a hidden wall safe. Inside lay a personal letter, sealed for decades, addressed simply, "To the sterling who finds the truth." With trembling hands, Alexander broke the seal. "To my successor, if you're reading this, then Klein's corruption has finally been exposed. I built Black Star not just to revolutionize banking, but to guard against those who would twist its power for their own gain. The protection systems were never meant to be weapons. They were meant to be shields for the vulnerable." Klein and his allies saw only the potential for control. When they approached me about weaponizing the code, I refused. I knew then that my time was limited. This letter is my insurance policy, my final testimony, but more importantly, it's my blueprint for what banking should become. The code you've recovered isn't just a security system, it's a foundation for transparent, ethical banking that serves people, not power. Use it wisely. Your grandfather, Walter Sterling. "Sir," a young FBI analyst interrupted, "we've found something in the sub-basement servers. Looks like a hidden directory, encrypted. It's marked Project Daybreak." The name triggered a memory from Alexander's childhood. His grandfather mentioning a project that would bring light to banking's darkest corners. At the time, it had seemed like just another bedtime story. Agent Chen accessed the directory. "It's incredible. Your grandfather didn't just build defenses, he designed an entire open-source banking framework. Transparent transactions, automated fraud detection, elder protection protocols, everything we need to rebuild trust in the system." Montgomery joined them, looking exhausted but satisfied. "Klein's talking. The promise of a lighter sentence has him naming names. Corrupt executives, compromised regulators. The whole network is unraveling." Alexander's phone buzzed with urgent messages. The media had gotten wind of the Black Star discovery. Markets were responding to news of the system-wide cleanup. And most importantly, Margaret Wilson was reporting that Sterling financial systems were ready to be brought back online. This is the moment, Alexander realized, not just to restart banking, but to remake it. Project Daybreak isn't just code. It's a chance to fulfill my grandfather's vision. He gathered his team in the facility's main conference room. FBI agents, cyber experts, and banking specialists crowded around as he outlined his plan. "We don't just restore the old system," he explained. "We implement Project Daybreak across Sterling Financial first, proving it can work. Open source the protection protocols. Make ethical banking the only acceptable standard." "The other banks won't like that," Montgomery warned. "Transparency cuts into profits." "Then let them explain to their customers why they're refusing to adopt proven security measures," Alexander countered. "Every elderly victim of Klein's scheme, every family that lost savings, they'll demand these protections." Agent Chen was already analyzing Project Daybreak's code. The implementation could be done in phases, start with Sterling's branches, then expand to partner banks. The protection protocols are designed to be modular. Banks can adopt them without compromising their core operations. As the team planned, Alexander received another message, this one from an unknown number. The eclipse ends, but shadows linger. Some trees need pruning before new growth can begin. He understood the warning. Klein's network was exposed, but banking's deeper problems, the temptation to exploit, to prioritize profit over people, remained. Project Daybreak wasn't just about technical solutions, it was about cultural transformation. "Get me a secure line to the Federal Reserve," he instructed. "They need to see this before we take Sterling systems back online." Project Daybreak isn't just going to protect our customers, it's going to change how banking works for everyone. The sun climbed higher over Boston as the Blackstar facility hummed with renewed purpose. In the server room, Klein's modern equipment was being replaced with upgraded versions of Walter Sterling's original systems. The old and the new working together to forge a more secure future. Alexander touched one of the original terminals. Remembering childhood lessons about trust and responsibility, his grandfather had built the foundation. His father had preserved its secrets. Now it fell to him to bring that vision to life. "Send out the call," he told his team. "Every bank that wants to restore public trust, every institution ready to put people before profits, Project Daybreak is their chance. Banking's next evolution starts today." The Sterling Financial Emergency boardroom crackled with tension. 2 days after the Blackstar revelation, Alexander faced his first major challenge. The bank's board of directors had convened an emergency session, and the opposition to Project Daybreak was immediate and fierce. "This is corporate suicide," declared Vernon Matthews, the longest-serving board member. "Open-source security protocols, complete transaction transparency, you'll destroy our competitive advantage." Alexander stood at the head of the table, his father's ledger in one hand, his grandfather's letter in the other. The room was divided. Half the board members appeared ready to revolt, while others seemed intrigued by Project Daybreak's potential. "Show them!" Margaret Wilson nodded encouragingly. Alexander activated the main screen, displaying real-time data from Sterling's first test implementation of Project Daybreak. The results were stunning. Customer confidence scores had skyrocketed. Transaction fraud was down 97%. Most importantly, elderly account holders were reporting unprecedented feelings of security and trust. But the costs, another director protested, "are nothing compared to what we've already lost," Alexander cut in. "While we were chasing profits, Klein's network stole billions. How many customers lost their life savings? How many families were destroyed?" The room fell silent as he played excerpts from the video evidence found at Blackstar. Board members watched in horror as their own banking practices were exposed. The hidden fees, the predatory policies, the systematic exploitation Klein had normalized. "This isn't just about Sterling Financial anymore," Alexander continued. "Every major bank is facing the same choice. We can lead the change, or we can become obsolete." His phone buzzed. Agent Chen's update. The FBI's investigation had expanded to 3 more banking giants. Their CEOs were being led out in handcuffs, their ties to Klein's network exposed by Blackstar's recovered data. "The banking industry is at a crossroads," Alexander addressed the board. "Project Daybreak isn't just an option, it's a lifeline. Our customers aren't just asking for better security, they're demanding a complete transformation in how we handle their trust." Suddenly, the boardroom doors burst open. A team of young analysts rushed in, led by James Chen, no relation to Agent Chen, Sterling's head of digital innovation. "Sir, you need to see this," James's voice was urgent. "Someone leaked details of Project Daybreak online. The public response." The screen filled with social media feeds, news headlines, and customer reactions. Project Daybreak was trending worldwide. People were sharing stories of banking abuse, demanding their institutions adopt the Sterling protocols. "It's gone viral," James explained. Customer advocacy groups are organizing. They're threatening to withdraw funds from any bank that refuses to implement the protections. Vernon Matthews slumped in his chair. The shareholders are calling for implementation, Margaret Wilson interrupted, holding up her tablet. Our stock is up 12% just on the news that we're considering these changes. The market is recognizing what Alexander's grandfather knew. Trust is the most valuable currency in banking. Alexander's phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message. The old guard fears sunrise, but some trees must fall for the forest to flourish. As if on cue, breaking news flashed across the screen. Western Alliance Bank, Morrison's former institution, was facing a customer exodus. Their refusal to comment on Project Daybreak had triggered a crisis of confidence. We're not just voting on policy changes, Alexander addressed the board. We're deciding whether Sterling Financial leads banking's evolution or becomes another cautionary tale. One by one, the directors began to shift. The evidence was undeniable. The industry was changing, with or without them. Project Daybreak represented more than just security protocols. It was a complete reimagining of the bank-customer relationship. There will be resistance, Agent Chen had warned him earlier. Klein's network wasn't just about theft. It was about maintaining power. The banking elite won't surrender that easily. She was right. Already, lobbying groups were mobilizing against Project Daybreak. Rival banks were preparing legal challenges. The old system was fighting back. But as Alexander watched his board members review the implementation plans, he saw something his grandfather had predicted: the power of truth to overcome entrenched interests. The same transparency that protected customers would now force the entire industry to change. We'll need to move quickly, James Chen advised. Other banks will try to develop competing systems, water down the protections. Let them try. Alexander smiled. Project Daybreak isn't just code, it's a standard. Every modification, every transaction, every decision becomes part of the public record. There's no hiding in the daylight. The board's vote was unanimous. Sterling Financial would become the first major bank to fully implement Project Daybreak. The transformation his grandfather had envisioned decades ago was finally beginning. But as the directors filed out, Alexander received one final message. The dawn reveals all shadows. Watch for those who prefer darkness. They strike hardest just before the light. The warning was clear. Banking's evolution would face more than just institutional resistance. Somewhere in the shadows, those who had profited from the old system were already planning their counterattack. Multiple denial-of-service attacks detected, James Chen announced, his voice tight with tension. They're targeting every Sterling branch implementing Project Daybreak. Alexander stood in Sterling Financial's new cybersecurity command center, watching as red alerts bloomed across the monitoring screens. 1 week into the implementation, the predicted resistance had arrived with devastating force. Sources, Agent Chen demanded, coordinating with FBI cyber teams. Distributed professional grade. Someone's hired the best hackers in the business. James pulled up attack pattern analyses. But there's something else. Look at the timing of these strikes. The attacks corresponded perfectly with Sterling's customer service peaks, targeting moments when transaction volume was highest. Only someone with intimate knowledge of banking operations could have planned this so precisely. They're not trying to steal data, Alexander realized. They want to destroy public confidence in Project Daybreak before it spreads. His phone lit up with urgent messages. Media outlets were reporting technical difficulties at Sterling branches. Social media was flooding with complaints about delayed transactions. The market was getting nervous. "Sir," a young analyst called out, "someone's leaking internal documents to financial blogs. Old reports out of context, suggesting Project Daybreak has security flaws." Margaret Wilson burst into the command center. It's worse. 3 board members just received letters threatening to expose their past connections to Klein's operations unless they vote to suspend Project Daybreak. Alexander's mind raced. The coordination of these attacks, cyber, media, and personal, pointed to something bigger than simple resistance to change. This was orchestrated warfare against banking reform itself. Pull up the Black Star files, he ordered. Cross-reference board members with Klein's network. As the team worked, Alexander received another anonymous message. Some shadows wear suits. Check the Federal Reserve meeting logs from 2008. The logs revealed a disturbing pattern. The week before his grandfather's accident, Walter Sterling had met with a secret committee of banking executives. The topic, systemic risks in digital banking. Among the attendees was a young Federal Reserve analyst named Victor Cranston, now the Fed's deputy chairman. Got something, James announced. The denial of service attacks. They're not just targeting our systems, they're probing for specific vulnerabilities in Project Daybreak's code. They're trying to find my grandfather's original backdoors. Alexander understood. The same ones Klein exploited. Agent Chen's tablet beeped with an urgent alert. Alexander, Cranston just called an emergency Federal Reserve session. They're considering classifying Project Daybreak as a systemic risk to banking stability. The pieces clicked together. Cranston had been there at the beginning, watching Klein turn Walter Sterling's protection system into a weapon. Now he was positioned to strangle Project Daybreak with regulatory red tape. James, show me the attack patterns again, Alexander requested. Something about their precision bothered him. Overlay them with Federal Reserve testing protocols. The match was perfect. The cyber attacks weren't just well-timed. They were following official Federal Reserve security testing procedures that Cranston had helped design. He's not just trying to stop Project Daybreak, Alexander said quietly. He's trying to prove it's dangerous, create a crisis that justifies shutting us down. But Cranston had made one critical mistake. By using official protocols, he'd triggered Walter Sterling's deepest security measures. Every probe, every attack was being logged and traced by Black Star's original systems. Send everything to Montgomery, Alexander ordered. Bank records, meeting logs, attack signatures. The FBI needs to move before Cranston can call that vote. Margaret Wilson was already working her own angles, rallying support from other board members. The threats backfired, she reported. Our people are angry. They're tired of being pawns in someone else's game. Alexander's phone buzzed with breaking news. FBI agents were entering the Federal Reserve building. Cranston had been caught trying to delete files linking him to Klein's network. But the cyber attacks continued, now with desperate intensity. Sterling's defenses were holding, but customer confidence was shaking. They needed a bold move to restore trust. Take us offline, Alexander commanded. What? James stared at him. All branches? That's exactly what they want. No, Alexander smiled. It's exactly what my grandfather planned for. Initiate Project Daybreak's emergency protocols. All of them. Walter Sterling's final safeguard activated. Every Sterling financial system went dark for exactly 60 seconds. When they returned, customers watched in awe as their banking interfaces transformed. Real-time transaction tracking, completely transparent fee structures, automated fraud detection with instant customer alerts. Everything Project Daybreak promised, demonstrated in one dramatic moment. Attack volume dropping, James reported, watching the monitors. They can't find targets anymore. The systems, it's adapting, learning from each attempt. Alexander received one final anonymous message. Dawn always follows darkness, but watch the shadows. Some will try one last strike before sunrise. The warning was prophetic. As FBI agents led Cranston away, Alexander knew the real battle was just beginning. Project Daybreak had survived its first major test, but more powerful enemies lurked in banking's shadows. The question wasn't if they would strike next, but when. The congressional hearing room buzzed with tension. 3 weeks after Cranston's arrest, Alexander found himself facing the Senate Banking Committee. Project Daybreak had become national news, and not everyone in Washington was celebrating banking's reformation. Mr. Sterling, Senator Harrison Blackwood leaned forward, his voice dripping with practiced concern. Can you explain why your transparency protocols have caused a 15% drop in major banks' profit margins? Alexander adjusted his microphone, aware of the cameras broadcasting this moment worldwide. Senator, those profit margins were built on hidden fees, predatory practices, and elderly exploitation. Project Daybreak didn't reduce legitimate banking income, it exposed systematic theft. A murmur ran through the chamber. In the gallery, Alexander spotted familiar faces. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Chen's widow, other victims of Klein's schemes. They had come to support banking reform, their presence a reminder of what was at stake. We have reports, another senator interjected, of foreign entities expressing concern about Project Daybreak's impact on international banking. The Chinese government specifically is worried about losing access to exploitation tools they purchased from Klein's network. Alexander finished. The room fell silent. The Black Star files revealed quite a list of international clients, Senator. Would you like me to elaborate? The threat was clear. Klein's corruption hadn't stopped at America's borders. Any government-opposing Project Daybreak might find its own banking crimes exposed. During a recess, Agent Chen pulled Alexander aside. We found something in Cranston's deleted files. Project Daybreak isn't the first attempt at banking reform. There were others. She showed him a classified document detailing previous whistleblowers, reform initiatives, and transparency campaigns. All had been systematically destroyed, their leaders discredited or worse. Behind each failure, the same shadowy organization appeared, the Heritage Group. It's a coalition of old banking families, Agent Chen explained. They've shaped financial policy for generations. Klein was just their latest tool. When your grandfather threatened their control, they had him killed, Alexander finished. And now they're coming for Project Daybreak. His phone buzzed with an urgent message from James. Emergency at Sterling HQ. Multiple board members missing. Alexander rushed back to find the command center in chaos. Margaret Wilson and 4 other reform-supporting directors had vanished after a lunch meeting. Their phones were off, their security details unconscious. Found this in Margaret's office. Montgomery handed Alexander a handwritten note. The message was brief. Sunrise can be delayed indefinitely. Choose wisely. They're trying to force a board vote, Alexander realized. Without Margaret and the others, the remaining directors could suspend Project Daybreak. But the Heritage Group had miscalculated. Walter Sterling hadn't just built banking safeguards. He'd documented everything about his enemies. The Black Star files contained a detailed organizational chart of the group's structure, including one crucial detail, their secure meeting facility. An abandoned mansion in the Berkshires, Montgomery confirmed, off the grid, heavily guarded, perfect for holding kidnapped board members. And perfect for their final stand, Alexander added. They're not just holding our people, they're gathering to plan Project Daybreak's destruction. Satellite imagery confirmed unusual activity at the mansion. Private helicopters arriving, armed security patrolling the grounds. The Heritage Group was assembling its full membership for the first time in decades. We have to move fast, Agent Chen warned. Once they realize we've found them. Sir! James interrupted. Someone's accessing Project Daybreak's core protocols. They're trying to implement emergency shutdown procedures. Alexander watched as Heritage Group hackers attacked Sterling's systems. But something was wrong. The attack patterns seemed familiar. "It's my father's code," he breathed. "They're using his personal access protocols, the ones that disappeared after his death." The truth hit him like a thunderbolt. There was only one way the Heritage Group could have those codes. One person who could have taken them the day Robert Sterling died. "Margaret," Alexander said quietly, "she's not their prisoner. She's one of them." Security footage confirmed it. Margaret Wilson, his father's trusted friend, calmly walking the kidnapped board members into Heritage Group vehicles. No resistance, no force. She was orchestrating the entire operation. Her family name was different. Back then, Agent Chen reported, digging through records, before her marriage, she was Margaret Heritage, the group's founding family. Alexander's phone lit up one final time. Some betrayals cut deeper than others. The Heritage Mansion holds more than just your board members. It holds every secret your family died trying to expose. Dawn comes, but only if you're willing to sacrifice everything to see it. The message was clear. To save Project Daybreak, expose the Heritage Group and rescue his board, Alexander would have to confront not just Margaret's betrayal, but decades of buried history. The true story of banking's corruption went far deeper than Klein or Cranston, and somewhere in that mansion, the woman he'd trusted like family was preparing to destroy everything 3 generations of Sterlings had fought to build. The Heritage Mansion loomed through the pre-dawn mist, its Victorian architecture a monument to old money and older secrets. Alexander studied the grounds through night vision binoculars from their hidden position in the surrounding woods. After spending his career in pristine boardrooms, he felt strangely comfortable back in his Michael Crawford disguise. "Security is tighter than a Federal Reserve vault," Montgomery reported, reviewing thermal imaging feeds. "Armed patrols, motion sensors, electronic countermeasures. They're expecting us." Agent Chen's tech team had established a mobile command center in an abandoned ranger station nearby. James Chen worked furiously at multiple laptops, probing the mansion's defenses. "The good news is they're running standard banking security protocols," James explained. "The bad news, they're running all of them layered. Penetrating electronically would take weeks." "We don't have weeks," Alexander replied. "Project Daybreak's core systems are fighting Margaret's attacks, but she knows all our fail-safes. Once the Heritage Group combines their resources—" "About that," Agent Chen interrupted, "we found something interesting in the Black Star files. The Heritage Group isn't just old banking families. They're the descendants of 19th-century robber barons who created the modern banking system." She displayed historical documents on her tablet. Every major financial crisis, every market manipulation, the group was there, profiting from chaos. They don't just want to stop Project Daybreak, they want to trigger another global meltdown. They can exploit. Alexander's mind raced. Margaret's betrayal suddenly made more sense. She hadn't just infiltrated Sterling Financial, she'd been playing a generations-long game. "Sir!" James called out. "I found a vulnerability. It's weird. The mansion's guest network has an open port. It's like someone wants us to find it." "It's an invitation," Alexander realized. "Margaret knows I'll come personally. She wants me inside." The plan came together quickly. While FBI teams positioned for a potential raid, Alexander would enter the mansion under the guise of surrendering. Agent Chen's people would piggyback on his credentials to infiltrate the security system. "One more thing," Montgomery handed Alexander a small device. "New prototype from our tech division. Looks like a normal banker's pen, but it'll record everything and transmit on quantum encrypted channels. Even their best scanners can't detect it." As Alexander adjusted his tie, deliberately crooked part of the defeated CEO look, his phone buzzed one last time. "The greatest lies are wrapped in family truths. Trust no memory tonight." The mansion's front gate opened as he approached. Guards emerged, their weapons carefully concealed under tailored suits. Professional, discreet. Everything about the Heritage Group was designed to look legitimate, while hiding darkness. "Mr. Sterling," a smooth voice greeted him in the marble foyer. Charles Heritage, Margaret's cousin and chairman of Heritage Financial, extended his hand. Or should I say, Mr. Crawford. That was quite a performance at branch number 247. Alexander noted the other figures emerging from shadows. Banking royalty. CEOs, chairman, financial dynasty heirs. Klein and Cranston had been their puppets. These were the real powers behind modern banking. "Margaret's waiting in the library." Charles smiled thinly. "She's quite eager to discuss Project Daybreak's future." The library was exactly what old money should look like. Leather-bound books, oil paintings, priceless artifacts. Margaret Wilson, no, Margaret Heritage, stood by a fireplace looking more regal and terrible than Alexander had ever seen her. "You won't need that recording device," she said calmly. "This conversation should remain between family." Alexander's hand froze at his tie. "How did you—" "Because I taught your father the same trick." Margaret's eyes softened slightly. "Did you really think all those years at Sterling Financial were just a cover?" "I loved your father, Alexander. I tried to protect him, by helping them kill him, by trying to give him a choice, the same choice I'm offering you now." She gestured to an old ledger on a desk. "Your grandfather's original notes on Black Star. The real ones, not the sanitized version he left behind." Alexander approached carefully. The ledger was authentic. He recognized Walter Sterling's handwriting. But as he read, his world tilted sideways. "Black Star was never meant to be a protection system," Margaret said quietly. "Your grandfather designed it to give the Heritage Group complete control over digital banking. But at the last moment, he changed sides, tried to turn it into Project Daybreak instead." "That's impossible," Alexander whispered. "He built it to help people. He built it for us. The Heritage Group raised him, funded him, shaped him, just like we did with your father, just like we tried to do with you." Margaret's voice held genuine regret. "Banking isn't about trust, Alexander. It's about power. Your grandfather understood that in the end." In his ear, Agent Chen's voice crackled, "We're in their systems, ready when you are." But Alexander barely heard her. The ledger in his hands was rewriting everything he thought he knew about his family's legacy. And somewhere in those pages lay the truth about what Project Daybreak was really designed to do. The library's ancient clock ticked heavily as Alexander turned the ledger's pages. Each entry revealed a darker truth about his grandfather's work. Project Daybreak hadn't been corrupted by Klein and his allies. Its core architecture had been designed for control from the beginning. "Your grandfather was brilliant," Margaret said softly. "He saw that digital banking would make traditional power structures obsolete. Black Star was meant to ensure the Heritage Group's survival in the new financial age." Alexander's fingers traced his grandfather's familiar handwriting, now seeing the hidden meanings behind each entry. The protection protocols were actually surveillance systems. The customer safety features were control mechanisms. "But something changed," he looked up at Margaret. "Didn't it?" She moved to the fireplace, touching an old photograph of Walter Sterling with a young Robert. He fell in love with the lie, started believing his own cover story about protecting people. When he tried to redirect Black Star's purpose, the group had no choice. "And my father? Was anything he believed real?" Robert discovered the truth gradually. Margaret's voice held genuine pain. "I watched him piece it together over years. That's why I stayed close, trying to guide him toward acceptance rather than resistance." Charles Heritage stepped into the library, Show him the rest, Margaret. He needs to understand what's really at stake. She pressed a hidden panel, revealing a wall safe behind a painting. Inside lay another ledger, this one bearing the Heritage Group's symbol. Project Daybreak's true design, Charles explained. Complete digital control over the global financial system, every transaction, every account, every dollar, all guided by the Heritage Group's algorithms. Not to steal or exploit, but to maintain order. The technical specifications were elegant. In their terrible simplicity, Project Daybreak wouldn't just make banking transparent, it would make it controllable at the deepest level. Your grandfather understood that true power isn't about wealth, Margaret continued. It's about stability. The Heritage Group has managed global finance for generations, preventing the chaos of truly free markets. In Alexander's ear, Agent Chen whispered urgently, "We've breached their systems, ready to move on your signal." But the decision was becoming more complex with each revelation. The Heritage Group's vision wasn't simple greed. It was a philosophy of controlled order versus unpredictable freedom. "What happened that night?" Alexander asked quietly. "When my grandfather died." Margaret's composure cracked slightly. He was going to release everything, not just Black Star's code, but the entire history of managed markets. It would have triggered global panic. Millions would have suffered in the chaos. So you killed him to protect your system. To protect everyone, Charles snapped. The public doesn't want true financial freedom, Alexander. They want the illusion of it. Your grandfather lost sight of that essential truth. Alexander's phone vibrated. A message from James. "Sir, Project Daybreak's core systems are destabilizing. Margaret's attacks are succeeding. We need to act now." The weight of 3 generations' choices pressed down on him. His grandfather had designed a system of control, then died trying to transform it into something better. His father had discovered the truth and worked in secret to expose it. "You have a choice," Margaret said gently. "Join us. Help us perfect what your grandfather began. Project Daybreak can be restored to its original purpose." "The Heritage Group isn't your enemy," Charles added. "We're the guardians of stability. Every major crisis in history, we've prevented far worse from happening." Alexander stood, the ledgers heavy in his hands. Everything he'd believed about. His family's legacy had been built on carefully constructed lies, but perhaps the lies had become something more important than the truth. "You're right about one thing," he said finally. "My grandfather designed Project Daybreak to change banking forever." His fingers found the pen Montgomery had given him, pressing a hidden switch. "But you're wrong about why." Alexander straightened to his full height. "He didn't have a change of heart. He designed it to expose you from the beginning." Margaret's eyes widened as alarms began blaring throughout the mansion. The Heritage Group's secret files were being broadcast worldwide. Black Star was never about controlling banking, Alexander continued. It was about making control impossible. Every feature you thought was a tool for power, it's a window for transparency. My grandfather built the ultimate Trojan horse. Charles lunged for a hidden alarm panel, but it was too late. FBI teams were already breaching the mansion's defenses. Using access codes Alexander's pen had transmitted during the conversation. "The hardest chains to break are the ones people think they need." Alexander quoted from his grandfather's hidden messages. "Banking doesn't need guardians, it needs sunlight." As Heritage Group members were led away in handcuffs, Margaret remained by the fireplace, looking suddenly old and tired. "We really did love your family," she said softly. "We wanted you to understand." "I do understand," Alexander replied. "That's why this has to end." The dawn was breaking over the mansion's grounds as Alexander emerged. His family's legacy, hadn't been destroyed by tonight's revelations, it had been fulfilled. Walter Sterling's greatest achievement wasn't designing Project Daybreak, but planting it like a seed within the Heritage Group's own systems. Now that seed had bloomed, and banking's longest shadow was finally facing the light, the world's financial markets opened to chaos that morning. As Heritage Group documents flooded the internet, stock exchanges from New York to Tokyo struggled to process the implications. Alexander watched from Sterling Financial's command center as a century of managed markets unraveled. Major banks worldwide are suspending operations, James reported, tracking the cascade of closures. Hong Kong, London, Frankfurt, they're all finding Heritage Group connections in their systems. Agent Chen's team had uncovered more than just banking manipulation. The group's tentacles reached into governments, corporations, and institutions worldwide. Every economic crisis, every market recovery, all had been orchestrated to maintain their control. "Sir," a young analyst called out, "you need to see this. People aren't panicking, they're organizing." The screens showed something unprecedented. Instead of rushing to withdraw funds, customers were demanding their banks adopt Project Daybreak's true transparency protocols. Reform Not Run was trending globally. "It's working exactly as your grandfather planned," Agent Chen realized. He didn't just expose the corruption, he gave people a real alternative. Alexander's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the raid. Bank CEOs worldwide were calling, some angry, some frightened, but most with the same question: how do we implement Project Daybreak? The Heritage Group's fatal flaw was underestimating the public, Montgomery observed, watching the news coverage. They thought people would choose comfortable lies over difficult truth. But the Heritage Group wasn't going quietly. Margaret's coding team had launched one final attack before their arrest, targeting the global SWIFT network that managed international bank transfers. "They're trying to trigger a financial heart attack," James warned. "If international transfers fail, global trade freezes." Alexander smiled. "Check the SWIFT protocols. Who designed their original security system?" James's fingers flew across his keyboard. His eyes widened. "Black Star code. Your grandfather's original version." "Dad used to say banking was like a game of chess," Alexander recalled. "The best. Moves are planned generations in advance." As they watched, Walter Sterling's dormant protocols activated within the SWIFT network. Instead of crashing, the system evolved, implementing Project Daybreak's transparency features automatically. The command center erupted in cheers as markets began stabilizing. The Heritage Group's final attack had only succeeded in vaccinating the global banking system against future manipulation. "Mr. Sterling," a senior analyst interrupted, "there's a situation at branch number 247. The branch where everything had started had become a spontaneous gathering point. Hundreds of people had assembled, not to protest, but to share stories. Elderly victims of financial fraud stood alongside young tech workers, all demanding change. "They're calling it the banking spring," Agent Chen reported. "Similar gatherings are happening at banks worldwide." Alexander's phone lit up with a message from an unexpected source, Mrs. Rodriguez, the undercover agent whose investigation had started everything. "Some springs need winter's darkness to bloom. Your grandfather would be proud." But amid the celebration, challenges loomed. Margaret's arrest had revealed the full scope of the Heritage Group's influence. Corrupt judges were already being pressured to block Project Daybreak's implementation. Political allies were mobilizing to protect the old system. You were protecting his plan. "The Heritage Group raised me to believe in controlled order." Margaret's eyes held deep sadness. "Your grandfather showed me something better, earned trust. I played my role, helping them think they were winning, while Walter's long game unfolded." Back at Sterling Financial, Alexander gathered his core team. The Heritage Group's data vault wasn't just an archive of corruption, it was a guide to systematic reform. Look at this, James highlighted patterns in the encrypted files. Each exposure of wrongdoing is paired with a corresponding solution. Release them together, and you prevent market panic. Your grandfather was a chess master, Agent Chen marveled. He didn't just plan the attacks, he planned the recovery moves. The next phase of Project Daybreak began taking shape. Sterling Financial would release carefully curated segments of heritage data, each accompanied by practical reforms. The truth would emerge like a sunrise, gradual, inevitable, and illuminating without blinding. "Sir," an analyst called out, "you should see this." The main screen showed Branch 247's lobby. A group of former Heritage Group victims had gathered spontaneously, sharing stories with new customers. But they weren't telling tales of loss. They were explaining how Project Daybreak had restored their faith in banking. "Trust isn't just about transparency," one elderly man told the crowd. "It's about making things right." Alexander received one final message from an unknown number. "Some legacies grow stronger in light than they ever did in darkness. The spring your grandfather planted is finally blooming." Looking around the command center at faces both old and new united in purpose, Alexander understood. Banking's transformation wouldn't come through sudden exposure or controlled order. It would come through the patient work of rebuilding trust, one transaction and one truth at a time. 6 months after the Heritage Group's fall, Alexander found himself back where everything had started, in front of his bathroom mirror. The fake beard and glasses of Michael Crawford lay in a display case at branch number 247, but their lesson remained. Sometimes you had to change your perspective to see the truth. "Final numbers from the global implementation," James reported during their morning briefing. "Over 3,000 banks have adopted Project Daybreak protocols. Consumer confidence in banking is at a 30-year high." The transformation had rippled far beyond finance. As Walter Sterling's carefully planned revelations emerged from the Heritage Vault, corrupt systems worldwide faced unprecedented scrutiny. "The Singapore market opens in 10 minutes, Agent Chen announced. They're the last major exchange to implement the new transparency standards." Alexander watched on. The command center's main screen as Asian markets prepared for their own banking revolution. His grandfather's chess game was entering its final moves, each piece positioned decades ago now, falling perfectly into place. "Mr. Sterling," a young analyst interrupted, "there's someone here you need to meet." In the lobby waited an elderly man Alexander had seen only in photographs. Thomas Chen, Mr. Chen's brother, recently arrived from Shanghai. He carried a weathered leather briefcase. "Your grandfather saved my life," Thomas said without preamble. 1987, during the market crash. The Heritage Group tried to destroy my bank, but Walter warned me, made me promise to keep something safe. Inside the briefcase lay another ledger, its pages filled with Walter Sterling's handwriting. But these weren't banking records. They were personal letters, one written every year after his death. "He knew they would come for him," Thomas explained, "so he left pieces of the truth with people he trusted. Some of us didn't even know what we were protecting until now." The letters revealed the full scope of Walter Sterling's plan. He hadn't just designed Project Daybreak to reform banking. He'd created a blueprint for protecting society through times of radical change. "Sir," James called urgently, "Margaret sent something from prison. You need to see this." The file contained surveillance footage from the night of Walter Sterling's accident, but it didn't show a murder. It showed Margaret helping him escape, implementing the first phase of his decades-long strategy. "He's alive," Alexander whispered. "Was Margaret's accompanying note read, "He died peacefully last year, knowing Project Daybreak was ready. His last words were about you, that you'd understand why the truth had to wait." As Alexander processed this revelation, global markets began their synchronized transformation. Project Daybreak's protocols activated worldwide, bringing Walter Sterling's vision of transparent, ethical banking to life. "Look at this," Agent Chen highlighted transaction patterns. "The system isn't just preventing fraud, it's evolving, learning from each attempt at manipulation. Your grandfather built something that could grow beyond its original design." In branch number 247's newly renovated conference room, Alexander gathered his core team. The wall-mounted screens showed real-time data from banks worldwide, each point of light representing a transaction protected by Project Daybreak. "We are seeing something unprecedented," James explained. "Banks aren't just adopting the transparency protocols, they're competing to exceed them. It's like the whole industry is racing toward ethical banking." Because trust is contagious, Alexander understood. Once people see it working, they demand nothing less. His phone lit up with a message from an unexpected source. Klein, writing from federal prison. "Your grandfather beat us decades before we knew we were playing. The Heritage Group thought power came from shadows. He proved it comes from light." The command center erupted in applause as Singapore's markets opened successfully. The last domino in Walter Sterling's master plan had fallen. Banking's transformation was now irreversible. "Mr. Sterling," a voice called from the doorway. Mrs. Rodriguez, Agent Martinez, stood with a group of elderly customers. "They wanted to show you something." One by one, they held up their phones, displaying Project Daybreak's interface. But it wasn't the technology that moved Alexander. It was the confidence in their eyes. These weren't just customers anymore. They were partners in a transformed financial system. "Your father would be proud," Agent Chen said softly, "both of them." Alexander touched the worn leather of Thomas Chen's briefcase, feeling the weight of his grandfather's letters inside. Walter Sterling hadn't just left a legacy of banking reform, he'd shown that real change required patience, sacrifice, and unwavering faith in the power of truth. "Sir," James interrupted gently, "it's time. The world press is waiting." As Alexander prepared to address the global media, his phone displayed one final message. The number was unknown, but the words could only have come from his grandfather's contingency plans. "Some dawns take lifetimes to break. But once they do, no shadow can stop them. The light you've helped bring isn't just about banking, it's about showing what's possible when trust becomes stronger than fear." 1 year to the day after Alexander Sterling first walked into branch, Number 247, as Michael Crawford, he stood before a global audience in Sterling Financial's renovated main hall. The space that once housed the Heritage Group's secret servers had been transformed into a public banking museum, documenting both the darkness of the past and the promise of the future. "Banking isn't about money," Alexander began, echoing words 3 generations of Sterlings had understood differently. "It's about trust, not trust demanded by power, but trust earned through transparency. Not trust protected by shadows, but trust strengthened by light." The museum's centerpiece told the story chronologically. Walter Sterling's original vision, Robert Sterling's quiet resistance, and the transformation that began with a CEO's decision to see his own company through his customers' eyes. Project Daybreak wasn't just about exposing corruption, Alexander continued. It was about proving that ethical banking isn't just possible, it's profitable, that serving people creates more value than exploiting them. The evidence was undeniable. Banks operating under Project Daybreak protocols reported record customer satisfaction and sustainable growth. The transparency requirements that many, had feared would destroy banking had instead revolutionized it. "But our work isn't finished," Alexander addressed the cameras. "Project Daybreak isn't a destination, it's a journey. Each generation must choose again between shadows and light, between control and trust." In the audience, he saw faces that told banking's whole story. Mrs. Chen, now leading financial literacy programs for immigrant communities. Agent Martinez, training a new generation of banking oversight officers. James Chen, whose technical team was constantly evolving Project Daybreak's protections. Margaret watched the broadcast from prison, where she continued helping authorities unravel the heritage group's remaining mysteries. Her betrayal had wounded Alexander deeply, but her complex loyalty to both sides had helped make the transformation possible. "The heritage group believed banking required darkness," Alexander concluded. "They thought ordinary people couldn't handle financial truth. My grandfather proved them wrong. My father preserved that proof. And together, we've all shown that sunlight isn't just the best disinfectant, it's the best foundation for growth." As he finished speaking, Sterling Financial Systems displayed a final message from Walter Sterling's archives. "To those who find this truth, banking's future belongs to those who earn trust, not those who demand it. The darkest nights produce the brightest dawns." Branch number 247 remains special, not just as a museum, but as an active bank where every transaction proved that ethical banking worked. The fake glasses in their display case reminded visitors that sometimes the most powerful changes start with one person willing to see things differently. The Heritage Group's Vault of Secrets continued releasing its carefully planned revelations, each truth accompanied by its solution. Walter Sterling's chess game played on, guided now by new hands, but following his vision of gradual, unstoppable reform. "Your grandfather would be proud," Agent Chen told Alexander as the crowds dispersed, "not just of what you exposed, but of what you built in its place." Alexander touched the worn leather briefcase containing Walter Sterling's letters, now part of the museum's collection. He knew it would take all of us, past, present, and future, every generation playing its part. As sunset painted the bank's windows golden, Alexander walked through Branch 247's lobby one last time. The space had transformed from a site of exploitation to a symbol of reformation, from a place of shadows to a source of light. His phone displayed one final message, this one from Thomas Chen. "Some legacies live in ledgers and laws, but the greatest legacy lives in lives changed and trust restored." The story of Sterling Financial and Project Daybreak would be studied for generations, not just as a tale of banking reform, but as proof that even the oldest shadows cannot stand against the light of truth. All it takes is people willing to look, to learn, and to believe in the power of dawn. Alexander Sterling had entered his bank in disguise, seeking to expose corruption. He emerged having discovered something far more valuable. That real change doesn't come from unmasking villains, but from empowering heroes. Heroes like his grandfather, his father, and all those who chose trust over power, transparency over control, and light over darkness. The sun set on banking's old era, but its light would rise again tomorrow, shining on a financial world forever. Changed by 3 generations of Sterlings and one simple truth, that the greatest power in banking isn't money, it's the courage to trust in something better.